It's a great honor for me to welcome all of you to this webinar on capacity mechanisms. Um, Capacity mechanisms, they are becoming an increasingly important topic, as you're probably all aware of. Our electricity system is getting more green, more reliant on intermittent renewable energy sources. And that obviously raises the question, what happens if those renewable energy sources, those volatile production, are not available? During these times, we need backup capacity, and that's exactly the scope of capacity mechanisms. The purpose of those is to ensure that these backup capacities, generation and flexible demand, are available, that the economic incentives are provided to them. And we're seeing that a lot of member states are introducing such schemes, such capacity mechanisms, and all these national developments are accompanied by an overall European framework and European legislation. And that will be the topic of today's webinar. And we are very grateful to have several excellent speakers and panelists from political institutions, from regulatory institutions, from academia and association, so a broad variety of perspectives. Thank you very much for being here. There is a small audience gathering in Brussels, so hello to Brussels. I don't know how many of you are there in person, but we have also broad participation online. I'm seeing now 60, 70 participants, 62 participants, 300 have registered. So thank you very much. We are very grateful for this participation. So very interesting sessions. In the first one, we are very grateful for the participation and contribution of the European Commission, that they are going to explain us how the European rules on capacity mechanisms are changing. First with the electricity market design reform, and now with the clean industrial state aid framework. Thank you very much. Looking forward to this. We also going to hear an experience from a member state. Thank you very much to the Polish Ministry of Environment and Climate to see how their capacity mechanisms is evolving to balance security of supply in the energy transition. Now, after this institutional introduction, we are very grateful as ENTSO-E that our experts can present you a policy paper, a recent policy paper, which we published in April this year on capacity mechanisms. So that's the second agenda item. That will then be followed by two panel sessions. One focused more on the regulatory side of things and the regulatory framework, and another one more dedicated at the practical implementation challenges. So these are two panel sessions, and we also have one very interesting contribution, which I'm personally very much looking forward to, and that is the question of whether there is a path towards a single target model in Europe in terms of capacity mechanisms. So that will be today's session, a very interesting content. I'm very much looking forward to this. I hope that it will be beneficial to all of you participants in Brussels, but also online, and that it helps us to increase our knowledge and capacity mechanisms, that we are able to share experiences, understand the different new needs that are there, and the points of views around the tables, virtual and in person. And I wish us all a very good webinar, very interesting discussions. Thank you very much for this. And with this, I'm handing over again to you, Marco.
Thanks a lot, Oliver, for this introduction. Just before giving the floor to our speakers, few housekeeping rules. First, the session is recorded. I hope nobody has an issue with that. For the people online, please turn off your camera and your mic. Interactions will be allowed later during the Q&A sessions and the panel discussions through Slido. You can see here the QR code, but we'll also show it later. For the people in the room, we will allow a few questions. So in that case, you can, of course, open your microphone. And so having said this, I pass the floor to the first speakers from the European Commission. Matt and Menia, please, the floor is yours.
Hello, good morning, everyone. I'm Elkomena Skriapa. I'm a policy officer at the European Commission in DG Energy. Maybe, yeah, thanks, Matt. So we're going to speak today with Matt about the streamlining procedures for capacity mechanisms. First, I will touch upon a bit on the streamlining report that was published a few months ago, and then Matt will dive into the specific state aid rules. Maybe a word before reaching actually the report and what we're streamlining. It's worth recalling where the framework comes from. No, the framework comes from the Clean Energy Package back in 2019. This is when the rules were a complete set of rules was introduced for the capacity mechanisms. So we've seen the few years already of the implementation. And then last year we had the electricity market design reform, where few changes were brought in the capacity mechanism sections. And one that we will be discussing today is basically the request from the co-legislators to the Commission to have a look how the procedures for the capacity mechanisms can be streamlined and simplified, as there have been concerns that the process is a bit lengthy and cumbersome. So what exactly the co-legislator requested the Commission to do? It's to draft a report where they would be assessing the possibilities for streamlining and simplifying the process, and also in this context specifically to request ACER to amend the ERA methodology, and following this process to come forward with concrete proposals on how to simplify the process. So what the report did, maybe, I think in the next slide, yeah. The report was published at the beginning of March. Probably you will have seen and read it by now. The aim of the report is to, actually it's threefold. Let's say first, to increase the flexibility for the member states when they want to introduce a capacity mechanism. So more flexibility when identifying an adequacy concern or in the process, how to do it. Second objective, let's say, to facilitate the technical work on the national authorities and the TSOs. And the third objective, to do that while ensuring the full compliance with our rules, the electricity regulation rules. So what the report did, the report first looks at the current framework for introducing a capacity mechanism, having already, let's say, we have already few state aid decisions, few capacity mechanisms in place to look back to and see how the process went, how the framework was introduced. The Commission also looks back at the ACER's monitoring reports, at some workshops that the Commission organized a couple of years ago. So it gathers, let's say, the feedback from all those, and does an evaluation of the current framework. What the report finds is that there have been challenges faced by the member state and stakeholders. And maybe to mention a few, I mean, they're all detailed in the report, but I would like to highlight three. First, thank you. Not yet. Yeah. It's the use of one single central reference scenario has been, there's been a concern that it's a bit too constraining as presenting one single truth. So that has been one challenge. The second has been the implementation of the ACER methodologies for setting the reliability standard metrics, so the value of lost load and the cost of new entry, that some member states found it a bit complex to do the process. And then the third challenge to mention is that there has been some concerns about computational differences when the member state, they have to do the model for 10 years. And that's why the report comes with measures, specific measures, and followed that with a proposal on the accelerated procedure for which Matt will speak. Maybe on the specific measures that the report brings is, first of all, the revision of the ERA methodology. And for this one, to say that the Commission in the report defines just the scope. Then it's for, and the request to ACER, then it's for ENTSO-E to come up with a specific detailed drafting proposals, how to implement this, this revision. So the process has been started. ACER sent a letter to ENTSO-E to launch the revision process. So this is already ongoing. And what will be one of the main, let's say, revisions in the ERA methodology is to include the additional central reference scenario. And here, the purpose behind this is to really try to capture with this additional central reference scenario the reality of what is happening on the ground. As there have been concerns that the central reference scenario used by now, which is based on the targets and objectives in the national climate and energy plans, that it's a bit too restrictive, let's say, and it doesn't reflect always reality. So the idea of this trends and projection scenario is really to try to look at the reality of what is happening. Has there been any delay in the implementation, or has there been any change in the policies of the member states? So that's the purpose of this. And of course, this will offer more flexibility to the member states because they will be able to use also this additional central reference scenario to identify an adequacy concern and when they want to introduce a capacity mechanism. Then a few other changes to their methodology that will bring more flexibility and simplification is the reduction of the target years. So now instead of looking at the whole 10-year horizon, it will be focused on fewer and a limited number of target years that are relevant for the decision making. And also the Commission requests ACER to take more into account the contribution of non-fossil flexibility to really try to implement, as is. We've seen that there have been rules on demand response and storage, but this they have not been implemented fully. So the idea is to really look into that. Then apart from this, from the revision of the ERA, just to mention also that the Commission also asks ACER to calculate the metrics that will facilitate the member states to set the reliability standard. So how to to do a study about the value of lost load and the cost of new entry, and to come with centralized figures. The idea behind this is that member states that wish to do so, they can use these centralized figures. It's a possibility for the member states that find it cumbersome to do the exercise, so it's an option for them to use that. And then the third point to mention here, measure broad, is for a request for ENTSO-E to publish the key data that will facilitate member states in establishing auction parameters and designing availability obligations. And here we're talking about publication of the rating factors, or like publishing with error results the energy not served per hour, just to name some examples. So the idea of all these measures brought by the report is really to try to simplify a bit the process, give a bit more avenues for the member states, give them more flexibility on what to use the ERA, to use those metrics, and of course increase transparency with the publication of key data that will help them design their capacity mechanisms. So I think that's all on the report, and then followed the report that was published in March. In parallel, the Commission published a proposal on how to because one of the other concerns that have been spotted in the report is that the process for capacity mechanism has been lengthy and cumbersome. So the idea is to try to look how the duration of the approval process can be shortened. So Matt will speak about the new draft state aid rules on this one.
Thanks, Mania. So on the next slide, please. Thanks. So as announced in the Clean Industrial Deal communication in February, and in line with the electricity regulation requirements that Mania has just spoken about, there's going to be a new state aid framework, at least we've proposed one, that includes a new section on capacity mechanisms. And this is enabling a fast-track approval for what we're calling target model capacity mechanisms. And this was subject to a consultation that closed at the end of April. So thanks to any of you who submitted replies to that. Next slide, please. So there are three main simplification goals that we had with the proposal that we've put out. The first one is about visibility, like really long-term forward visibility, because we think at least it can be helpful for member states and national authorities and those involved in what are normally quite long discussions at national level to know when they start those discussions certain destinations that are not going to be problematic at all in when it comes to the state aid approval or the compatibility with the sectoral legislation at the European level. So this aims to do that. Secondly, there's this concept of a one-stop shop. So as you are all probably aware, rules at European level for capacity mechanisms are now in different places. So there are some relevant rules, very relevant rules, of course, in the electricity regulation. There are state aid guidelines, and there are also methodologies that have been created by ACER following part of the rules in the electricity regulation that are all now relevant. And so the idea of this one-stop shop approach is that it gives a clear view of aspects of capacity mechanism design that are okay in relation to all of the different rules that exist in those different places. And then the third goal here on the slide is about simplifying participation for market participants. And so the idea here is that we've got kind of, as predicted, quite a fragmented picture in Europe, since different member states use different capacity mechanism designs and then usually have a different approach to cross-border participation in their measures. And the idea with this target model proposal is that if member states choose to use these target models or aspects of them, that could create some harmonization, and that might then simplify participation for market participants, which could potentially reduce costs. There's two more points, though, that I want to make on this slide. So one is that the existing state aid guidelines, SEAG, will remain applicable. They're not being replaced by this new Clean Industrial Deal state aid framework. So all of the previous leeway that member states had is preserved there. And it's not that any member state is required to use the target models being defined in the new state aid framework. If member states can use some of the features of target model, that will still simplify approval under the existing state aid guidelines. So we can assume where we've defined these requirements, compatibility is possible also under the existing guidelines. And then, so one thing is to just be clear, this is an option. There's nothing mandatory about this. It's what I sometimes have been calling a very tentative step towards harmonization, and still respecting member states' freedom in this area. The other last point I want to make is that these simplification goals can only be achieved with somewhat complex requirements. So if you want to create this forward visibility and you want to give certainty on compatibility with different rules in different places that I've mentioned, and you want to do that in a fast-track way, which means that you don't have a lot of discussion with member states in this process. Actually, we're aiming for no discussion. It's a checklist, effectively. If a member state meets one of the requirements in the new framework, the idea is there is no discussion about that. But so to achieve that kind of simplification, you do need quite a lot of detail in the rules, and that's in conflict with another type of simplification, which would be very simple rules. But I suppose that's obvious, but we're having that discussion quite a lot because there's obviously a wish that we would have simpler rules. The problem with simple rules is that they then are open to interpretation and definitely need discussion. So yeah, just to recognise that. I think it's worth saying as well that we have in the process also removed certain requirements from the SEAG. So if you follow a target model and go on this fast track process, you do not, for example, need a public consultation that is otherwise required in the SEAG. Next slide, please. I've added one more slide here on. In terms of the content, Guillaume will cover that later, my colleague, in the second panel session. But I wanted to add one more slide here on one specific issue that's been raised by a lot of respondents to the consultation, which is that what we say in the target models is that you need to use the European Resource Adequacy Assessment and not a national one. And the reason for that is because we, as I said, we're aiming for a fast track that does not require discussion. And if you go with a national resource adequacy assessment, then you automatically have certain procedural requirements from the electricity regulation. So, I mean, the differences between the national resource adequacy assessment and the European one have to be examined by ACER, and they have to issue an opinion. And then, unless the member state is following every recommendation in the ACER opinion, they have to publish a follow-up report explaining with detailed reasons why they don't follow ACER recommendations. And so those steps can't fit well in this fast track process, and especially as also there's no way that we can think of to enable like the discretion that involves to happen without some kind of discussion. So I just wanted to explain why NRAs are not in the fast track model. But as I said, this is an option. So member states that wish to follow some aspects of the target model but use a national resource adequacy assessment may do that. They just need to be aware that then those procedural requirements on use of national assessments have to be followed, and that element would have to be discussed as part of an assessment under the SEAG rather than the new state aid framework. So I hope that's clear. I'm happy to discuss that with you.
Thank you, Matt. Now give the floor to Adrian from the Polish Ministry of Environment and Climate. We don't have slides, but yeah, feel free to.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks a lot. Thanks for the invitation. It's always good to be at ENTSO-E. I didn't prepare any slides, but I do have a pretty good excuse. I come directly from Luxembourg, where we had environment and energy councils there, so I didn't really have time to prepare anything. But here I am. I'm happy to a couple of thoughts and achievements that we actually managed to have during our last 6 months of the Polish presidency. We actually had a very important discussion on energy security and capacity mechanisms on Monday during the Energy Council. So it's a very timely discussion that we have today. And happy to share a couple of outcomes of that discussion. I know that the capacity mechanisms were one of the priorities for Polish presidency. We tried to make it a normal feature of the electricity market. So that's why we try to build a narrative around three main aspects of the capacity mechanism. One is that the as Oliver said at the beginning, the capacity mechanisms are cornerstone for energy security and providing stability to the system, and that's why we put a very huge emphasis on this aspect of capacity mechanisms in the presidency conclusions that we adopted on Monday. And there's a huge part of the text that says about the necessary stability of the electricity system in Europe that will be brought by capacity mechanisms eventually. Around that, we also thought that because this at some point will be a normal feature of the market, we need member states to embark it as quickly as possible and in a very simple way. So that's why we welcome very much all the aims by the European Commission to provide that simplification rules so that member states can apply those mechanisms in a very easy way. Our systems become more and more complex every day, and I think they crave for more stability that capacity mechanisms can bring. I have a feeling that, and that was also like the outcome of the discussions that we had on Monday, that if we want to proceed with our energy transition, we need to have a system that will provide security for all consumers, both industries and households. So I think this is also like a role for capacity mechanisms, and that was also very clear from the discussions that we had at the ministers' levels. The other feature that we tried to discuss was the regionalization of capacity mechanism, because we know that this is a very it could be a very expensive state aid tool. So in order to make it more affordable for more member states, we thought that we could try to use a regional approach to that concept. We know that we have multiple examples of countries having gaps, generation gaps, which then create price spikes. And one of the tools that could address that problem could be embarking on capacity mechanism. And if you do that in a regional manner, then you could share the cost among member states while having the benefits of a proper system of capacity mechanisms. So we try to build a narrative on that, and that was actually very much supported by many member states, that we could test this opportunity and together try to create rules for going this avenue. The other element that we very much like about capacity mechanisms, and especially about the regional approach to that, is that the need for market integration, because in order to go ahead with introducing a regional approach to capacity mechanisms, you need to coordinate among member states and at least try to align certain policies and frameworks. And that's another step towards building a genuine energy union. And our position is that if we want to have the real benefits of internal energy market, we need to become more and more integrated. And I think the regionalization of capacity mechanisms and of this safety net that capacities provide could be a step into building a more integrated market and more energy union. So I'm pretty I'll be happy to say more about the discussions during the panel, but I'm pretty positive about the outcomes of the discussion. I think that there's genuine interest among member states to try to go ahead in that direction, and I think there's growing understanding as well that the capacity mechanism or adequacy tools will be more and more in need to provide the stability of the system. So thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot to all the speakers. We have time for maybe one or two questions before we move to the next agenda point. I would privilege the audience in the room at this time. Anyone? Burning question? Bram, yes, please use the mic.
Thank you, and good morning. I'm Bram Kleijs of the Regulatory Assistance Project. I have a question for Adrian, if you allow me. So you mentioned the interest in regional capacity mechanisms or markets. Would you consider the proposal for more streamlining and the target model and applying same design features of capacity market as provided now or as proposed in the state aid framework, a move towards such a regional capacity market? Because supposedly if everybody has the same capacity mechanism, especially in neighboring states, that would go in that direction, or is there something else? I'm just wondering if you could speak a little bit more to that regional idea.
I think it's a long shot, right? To establish such a regional approach to capacity mechanism and such a regional model. But in theory, I would leave that to member states to decide on what sort of aligning instrument they would like to introduce. But in principle, that yes, I mean that would at some point require member states to have like a very similar approaches to both assessment of adequacy, but also like the very same instrument applied within the capacity market model. So at some point it would require more and more harmonization.
Thank you. Maybe one last question. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Aida from Mir Electric. I have a question for DG Competition, Matt. If there's any reconsideration on the cost allocation methodology and the draft guidelines compared to the ones that will be adopted. Thank you.
Thanks, Ida. So it's definitely one of the points being discussed, but I can't say anything about what the final text will look like at this stage. This should be, I mean, the process should be finalized very soon. So yeah, you shouldn't have to wait long.
Thank you. I would leave the other questions. I see there's already one in the chat, but we'll ask the people online to use Slido. Leave the other questions for the panel, which will come just after the presentation of ENTSO-E policy paper. So I would call to the stage our colleagues Javier, Camille, and Connell to present. Thanks.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Thanks a lot for joining us and for your interest in our presentation also about this policy paper that we recently published. Today we have a small representation of the team, although there are other experts among the audience. And if we go directly to the next slide, I can start with the presentation. So why, what for, and how we did this exercise? First of all, why? So as I already said by several speakers, energy transition that we are undergoing brings challenges associated to adequacy, but also new challenges, new system needs that we think capacity mechanisms can also contribute to. We have some ideas on that on the paper. Also, we have seen in the presentation by EC and also by the Policy Ministry that there is a shift in EU policy perspective. So capacity mechanisms are acknowledged as a new feature, so to say, of the market. We are acknowledging as well everyone that energy-only markets they can in certain conditions and in certain member states not deliver the sufficient investment signals needed for the capacity, the backup capacity required for associated to energy transition, and then the empirical evidence of an increasing number of member states considering capacity mechanisms. So all this context led us to give a further thought to capacity mechanism in the shape of this policy paper with three objectives. First of all, looking ahead. So we'll try to propose a long-term vision of capacity mechanisms. So not only how they can contribute to adequacy concerns, but also how they can contribute to enabling a cost-effective, competitive and secure energy transition. And also looking to the past and learning from the challenges that we have faced in the TSO's experiences implementing capacity mechanisms that are already in place. And then with all this, try to propose recommendations for improving the regulatory framework so we can get the most of capacity mechanisms. How we have done it, of course, describing this design existing checking the challenge and how they have been overcome and the results that those strategies have provided. We have also thought about the potential evolution of system needs and policy context. We have looked to all the different capacity mechanism designs that we could think of with all the experts from different TSOs within ENTSO-E umbrella. And coming with the idea that we don't find a one-size-fits-all solution, basically because there are very different kind of challenges associated to energy transition. Not all of them are the same or apply to the member states, and also the level of concern or risk is changing. So if we go to the next slide with this. With these three axes, so to say, we have come with this policy paper that is available for the public since April. It is a long one, so in these times we need also to give short pieces of information. So we also made a complementary 2-page policy brief where we just gathered all the recommendations and key messages that we came out with following the result of our exercise. Today we are not going to present the whole paper and all the ideas, but the most maybe relevant ones, or the ones that we consider that contribute the most also to the discussions in the next panels and in the whole session. But I wanted to show you the structure of the paper so you can have an idea of other ideas that are in the paper. So mainly there are 2 blocks here, section 2 and section 3. The section 2 is more, as I was saying before, looking at the past and trying to learn from challenges experienced in the past. So how we ensure that the capacity mechanism effectively provide the needed capacity to solve adequacy concern, how we make them economically efficient, and how we can better distribute the cost among the consumers. Participation of technologies. We talk a lot about technological neutrality of capacity mechanisms in the framework of energy transition, and trying to ensure clean capacities are in place. But in the exercise of the paper, we also saw that maybe technology neutrality is not maybe the best term. So we talk more about technology inclusiveness, or trying to lower barriers and so on for new technologies, minimizing side effects, not only in the functioning of the different timeframes of the market, which of course from long term to balancing timeframe, but also in the form of affecting different competitiveness between neighboring member states, depending on whether they have or not capacity mechanism, or depending also of the design of the capacity mechanism, trying to minimize those effects. And then cross-border participation, which of course it is proving to be one of the most challenging, maybe, functionality to be implemented. That's looking at the past, and then looking at the future. And then in the section 3, we talk about synergies, because we were discussing that the capacity mechanisms, also with the new paradigm that we are facing together with an energy transition, they can also contribute to other system needs, provide new not only adequacy resources, but also flexibility, congestion management, and so on. And then, even if of course, given the diversity of challenges faced by the different member states, we believe that there is the need of diverse capacity mechanisms design. We also see that there can be some aspects of the design that can be in the future, with more experience, of course, streamlined among Europe or harmonized. So that would be a very high-level summary of the paper. If we go to the next slide, we want to show you this figure that we have elaborated using the data from ACER monitoring report on security of EU electricity supply. That illustrates what we were saying at the beginning. Also, Oliver has said, capacity mechanisms are are growing, are gaining ground in the EU. They are becoming a structural trend. We have many member states already with capacity mechanisms in place. We have many member states already considering the possibility of implementing capacity mechanisms, and all this is due to the challenges associated to energy transition, mainly, high res production, reducing the prices, limiting the operating hours of some technologies. So, it is clear that capacity mechanisms are a needed tool, but also we want to say that these challenges, they can vary also in the time. So even if this doesn't mean that all the member states may need capacity mechanisms, and it doesn't mean either that member states needing a capacity mechanism in a certain point in time will always need it, or that the capacity mechanism design that they need for a certain period of time will continue to be the same capacity mechanism design that they may need in a later stage. So if we go to the next slide, we can see a picture of not all the functionalities that we have been studying and assessing, but a good representation of it, and the classical taxonomy of the different capacity mechanisms, possible capacity mechanisms, and this is to continue insisting in this idea, also said in the previous slide, that the need of the kind of challenge that a member state may face could vary, and depending on the challenge that the member state is facing, it may need to switch to evolve the capacity mechanism design in place. So in our paper, we try to depict the different capacity mechanisms and the pros and cons for the different possible challenges associated to the energy transition. So in the next slide, before leaving the floor to my colleagues, just a summary of what Conal and Camille will be depicting more in detail. These are the four key design challenges that we have decided to explain a little bit more today, because we also see that they are pretty aligned or related to the discussions ongoing and nowadays, and that will be further discussed in the panel. So, as said, cost efficiency and procurement. Over procurement is a risk, and also giving not the right signals to the market participants. It is also a risk in terms of functioning of the market. So this is one of the challenges. Technology inclusivity, again, linked to facilitating emerging technologies to acquire capacity contract in the capacity mechanism, alignment with system needs. So getting the capacity mechanism with the appropriate signals, again, for the market participants to follow the system needs in short-term market and cross-border participation. As said before, that it is showing to be a complex functionality to be implemented. So these are only four of the key design challenges that we identify in the paper, and now my colleagues Conal and Camille will further develop on. So I would pass now the floor, I believe, to Conal. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. So I'm dealing with the first one on efficient procurement and cost distribution. Kind of one of the first points we look at in this section is that procurement must go beyond today's cheapest option. That the temptation with capacity mechanisms is that it should just be money to keep an existing resource that's able to that could be extended for a couple of years. That a disproportionate amount of the financial resources go to such units. But actually, capacity mechanisms should be thinking in a long-term perspective in terms of what's sustainable and reliable from a climate and a financial perspective, from a 2050, from a long-term perspective, not just kind of keeping today's resources going. Mechanisms like reliability options can help to control the costs. So a reliability option basically allows to recoup the difference between a set strike price and a market price, which would mean that the kind of like if capacity mechanisms are essentially providing a floor to units to units financial situation, that also there should also be some sort of a roof to how much they can benefit, because kind of in market-wide capacity mechanisms, units often have other revenue streams such as system services or even intraday markets, so actually these units are kind of stacking revenue from various sources. So that needs to be kind of understood and managed. Then another issue is penalties. So obviously, if you have a capacity mechanism, what you're looking to solve for is maybe a couple of hundred or maybe even a couple of dozen hours when the system is really in stress. That's what you're looking to buy. And if you would be providing that money 12 months of the year to a unit, and then when you need it at a particular moment, the performance isn't there, then of course that's a failure, and that should not be rewarded. In fact, that should be penalized. So the temptation is, of course, to say that absolutely penalties for not performing in the capacity market should be very strong, and that non-performance can take two forms. It can be not performing at the time when you need it, or not getting built. If you have promised to build a unit 4 years from now, and if that doesn't get built, that's another type of failure that needs to be managed. So penalties need to be strong. However, if we're looking at private sector entities fulfilling these roles in the capacity mechanism, you can't really have unlimited penalties, because a private sector entity can't go to their bank manager essentially and say, oh, I'm looking to do something and there's a potential unlimited liability. So how do you kind of cap it so that the penalties exist, but they're not so scary that you end up having units saying, well, okay, we're not joining this capacity mechanism. Then the next very important question is how to distribute costs fairly and efficiently. So as mentioned, you're looking to solve for a couple of dozen or a couple of hundred hours per year. So how do you reward participants and types of demand that actually during such times could say, actually, we're able to flex down at such a time. If the system's in stress, we can play a good role there. So whether that's industry or data centers or different things, if they can provide flexibility at those stress times, they should be rewarded, and that's a major theme across European electricity markets at the moment. Then the next issue around transparent billing, so kind of including the capacity market costs can serve as a price signal. It can kind of bring more awareness to this as an issue. But more explicit mechanisms, really like more creative solutions such as capacity subscription contracts or special connection charges, for people who are able to locate themselves in a less stressed part of the grid in a country, or people who are able to have some sort of a contract saying if we're told to turn off 10% of the time or 5% of the time, then we're not we don't have to really support this as financially, because we're not part of we wouldn't be part of the problem in that situation. Our flexibility is part of the solution. Then that's definitely something that should be encouraged. Because currently, according to I think recent Acer security of supply, currently only kind of less than 5% of capacity market capacity is provided by the demand side, and improving that would be very beneficial. Next slide, please. Great. So next one being kind of, I think Javier already mentioned kind of the difference between neutrality and inclusivity being an important part of the paper. So many kind of technology neutrality is a word that's used, but in capacity mechanisms, maybe it's not optimal, because if you're just being neutral and you just say, okay, we'll take the cheapest or the lowest cost, whatever term you want to use, you'll end up just kind of like stringing along an existing resource for another year. So actually getting that fair access for technologies, maybe somebody could need a 10-year contract or a 12-year contract or something to get a unit built that actually provides the sustainability from a climate perspective and from a financial and system services perspective. That's very important. So short contract, and then kind of also without kind of tailored support, that capacity mechanisms should be able to identify the the differences that a new long duration or short duration battery would have versus different demand side technologies, that the capacity mechanism shouldn't be blind to the differences faced by such units, but actually should kind of understand and incentivize those things. Derating factors. So many of you are familiar with the derating factors, being that actually a unit might have a label of being 100 megawatts, but actually the TSO and other can look and say actually the experience says that actually the derating says that actually there's a significant risk of multiple types of these technologies not working at the same time, or being because of their where they are located. So derating factors says we're not just looking at the nameplate capacity, we're looking at what we really think is your contribution in the stress times that we're worried about, and that much must capture how different technologies actually will be there to help both temporally and geographically inside a country when in the stresses that we're worried about. And then it's important to kind of regularly review those, because the system is always evolving, both the capacity mechanism itself and the other parts of the system, to review that to check that actually you do have that kind of arsenal of the different technologies available to meet the evolving issues that your system is facing. So I think that's it. Handing over to Camille.
Yes, thank you, Connell. In the course of writing the capacity mechanism paper, we also identified several system needs that we think that capacity mechanisms can contribute to, and these actually present both opportunities and challenges. Now, first things first, I think it's important to highlight that the main goal of capacity mechanisms is that we should ensure adequacy with capacity mechanisms. That's their entire goal. But they should do while taking into account several other constraints of the energy markets, one of which is that we should always take into account that even though we have a capacity mechanism, that they should not hamper with the efficient dispatch of units. And in doing so we cannot make capacity mechanisms interfere with those. One subtopic that we also identified there is the development of demand-side management. So those are flexible capacities that we really want to just react to market price signals. It's important that capacity mechanisms can contribute to unlocking this extra capacity that is already present in the market, but just needs the extra nudge to be unlocked. So there's a very dedicated role for capacity mechanisms there. A second topic that was identified is that we need capacity mechanisms to and diversified capacity mix that encourages flexibility. And it's important that there are also here different ways in which units can contribute to adequacy. We have regular participation to the markets, but there is also ancillary services. We also have other topics such as the tariff reforms and flexibility schemes. There are certain overlaps between these different actions that are taken by policymakers, and it's very important to take into account all these different engagements that are being done on the energy markets, and to make sure that there are no inefficiencies between these two when also using a capacity mechanism on the energy markets. What's also important is that if we want to go for a varied capacity mix, is that we need to take into account just the development constraints of these different technologies. And one important topic there is sequential auctioning, by which we mean that we can't rely on only, for example, an I-4 auction for a certain delivery period, but also I-1 or even I-2 auctions. The reason we do this is that certain technologies have different development times or lead times for their construction, and that if we want to create an optimal environment for each technology to participate in capacity mechanisms, it's important that we cater to their specific needs and to allow them a fair opportunity to participate in capacity mechanisms. In doing so, and it's also already highlighted by other writings about capacity mechanisms, it's already been highlighted that sometimes capacity mechanisms tend to rely too much on thermal technologies. If we can rely more on sequential auctioning and diverse the different technologies that we procure, then we hope that we can definitely contribute to fostering a diverse capacity mix in the different countries with capacity mechanisms. And then lastly, what is also important to highlight is that there are definitely also bidding zones within the European Union that have strong locational signals and needs in specific regions of their bidding zones. And also there, it is important that we can develop capacity mechanisms that take into account these locational constraints and that give certain boosts to capacities that can be developed in the places where they are most needed. Also, the topic about congestion definitely comes in here, and also flexibility. But again, I've already talked about flexibility schemes, and it is also important that there are no inefficiencies between different plans that are being developed by policymakers. And then the last topic that I wanted to highlight on this slide is that also dynamic mechanisms that are more or less adaptive, so that capacities can react when and where they are most needed. So in conclusion, a well-designed capacity mechanism, if you talk a lot about capacity mechanism, it starts a bit a well-designed capacity mechanism can result in a well-balanced capacity mix that can also cater to flexibility and locational and timing needs. On the next slide, then, we also have a couple of points on cross-border participation, which is a bit of a hot topic nowadays when more and more member states of the European Union start developing their capacity mechanisms. And also here, there are multiple opportunities and challenges. I think it's fair to say that there are definitely possibilities to have a more efficient procurement of capacity across the different member states of the European Union, but it's very important that we take into account both the risks for over and under procurement when talking about cross-border participation. Every member state that installs a capacity mechanism will do so based on their own volume assessment, and it's extremely important that every member state takes into account developments that takes place also in other countries, to make sure that they have the most up-to-date view on available capacities that can be taken into account to consider their needs for capacities. Also here, the topic of sequential auctioning actually comes into play again, because these allow a bit for corrective auctions, so to say, that even though the first auction for a certain delivery period has already taken place, then following up auctions can already take into account the developments that have taken place in neighboring countries in the meantime. That helps with avoiding over-procurement, where member states procure too much capacity, but there is also a risk for under-procurement here, namely when it is a possibility for capacities to participate in multiple capacity mechanisms at the same time. When different member states are relying on the same capacity at the same time for security of supply, this actually creates a risk where one capacity can't obviously deliver at two places at the same time. So there it's important that we do not have any double counting and to make sure that everyone can contract the capacity that is actually needed. Now also the last point that I want to make on this slide is that for transparent cost allocation between countries, also their capacity mechanisms offer certain opportunities. But what we also notice there is that there's a vast discrepancy between the different methodologies on how this is put in place between the different member states. So also there, a harmonized framework is necessary to prevent these types of inefficiencies and market distortions, and to also there foster more cross-border collaboration to guarantee security of supply.
Thank you, Camille. So if we go to the next slide now, we are going to show you, in 3 slides, we are sharing between the 3 of us the recommendations and the key messages that we come with following the exercise. As I said before, this makes 2 pages only, so only the recommendation. So this is in 3 slides. As you can understand, we do a very short summary of our findings. So I take the first 2 ones. So introduce capacity mechanisms where needed and make them fit for energy transition. This looks obvious, but behind this recommendation, we make the point on prioritize low carbon flexible capacity. We also point at the need of having flexibility to adapt capacity mechanism design to the changing challenges that each system may be facing. And also, apart from updating the capacity mechanism design regularly, to also contemplate the phase-out mechanism of the capacity mechanism once it is no longer needed when that time comes. Then another recommendation, so ensure effective capacity delivery at the lowest cost for consumer and with a reasonable cost recovery. Yeah, also Conor has presented some of the ideas on this. So we have thought a lot about cost distribution, how to do it very fairly. So based on consumers' contribution to adequacy, minimize cost by having a strike, well-calibrated strike price, penalties as with the risk associated, as Conor was saying before. Regarding how to procure capacity, we tend to think that the centralized procurement contributes better to this objective of effective capacity at lowest cost. And then, I said also before, try to mitigate market distortions with, I think it was Camille who made the point on having sequential options that would allow us fine-tuning the capacity, the procurement, and try to minimize at least the risk of having over-procurement. So next slide.
Thanks. So the third recommendation is around evolving from technology neutrality to technology inclusivity. So that means addressing specific barriers for demand side response and storage to boost low carbon participation and get that total portfolio that leads to adequacy. Using tailored design features, the length of the design feature, the length of the contract being one of the most important ones for procuring new assets rather than just rolling on existing assets, and kind of different service level agreements on the demand side and the multi-year arrangements. Phased auctions, which I think Camille mostly spoke about. So currently kind of auctions 4 years out and 1 year out is kind of the norm, but maybe that will evolve to make longer to incentivize those longer duration technologies. Designing capacity mechanisms to address cross-border broader system benefits and flexibility. So rewarding that flexibility and contribution beyond adequacy, that services are becoming increasingly important as we rely more and more on renewables. So capacity mechanisms can be cognizant of those technologies that are good at providing those services, and that but then you need to balance, if you have a separate mechanism around system services, how do you make that, how do you harmonize that in your system from a revenue perspective for market participants if they're operating in the capacity mechanism and the system services space as well as potentially other spaces. Where needed, include local signals. So a lot of times issues are might be centered around the capital city in a country, or some other place with more adequacy issues. So including those local signals can definitely be helpful. Coordinate with those flexibility schemes to avoid overlaps and kind of unlock the synergies, as was mentioned, and then kind of try to make it as simple as possible with design updates and stakeholder input, because a country's adequacy situation will be changing as units retire and units come on stream, and new sources of demand also come. So kind of trying to make it as simple as possible for schemes to kind of keep up with the changing landscape of a country's electricity system. So that's it from me. Over to Camille.
Yes, and then I'll conclude with some recommendations and key messages for the cross-border topic. I think the first thing, and that's actually the most important thing, is that we need to support more the international collaboration that is needed for setting up cross-border participation in capacity mechanisms. I can only speak for my personal experience with the Belgian CRM and the cross-border participation that we have there, but it's extremely surprising how much complexities that pop up when you start collaborating with the, for example, French, German, or Dutch colleagues. And so it's important that we take into account the return on experience that we have there, and that we can boost our efficiency and reliability that we have when setting up cross-border participation. And that strongly links also with the second point on the slide right here, is that we really need to also simplify these cross-border processes, because right now there's a lot of complexities there, and also for market participants, but also policymakers, it's actually really difficult to see actually what's going on precisely. There's so many small details, nooks and crannies that keep happening, and it's very important that while simplifying, we can also ensure a fair contribution of these foreign units to domestic capacity needs. That links to the third point there, because one of the key points that we highlighted also in the paper is that there is a possibility to harmonize certain key processes. Typically, participating in a capacity mechanism involves certain steps that are relatively identical across different capacity mechanisms. I'm talking about, for example, a pre-qualification or a registration phase, whatever you want to call it, then an auction phase, then perhaps of a delay phase between the auction and the actual delivery period, and then the delivery period. And we can, for example, already gain some efficiencies if we already identify these building blocks and make them identical across the different, well, high level identical, of course, and make them identical across the different member states, so that for units that want to participate in cross-border mechanisms, that it's more easier for them to grasp what is going on, because, for example, the pre-qualification phase is relatively the same between different member states. Lastly, if you want to enable a gradual implementation of cross-border participation, what we notice that sometimes due to complexities, it's not possible to, from the beginning, have a full-fledged cross-border capacity mechanism. And right there, what we would like to propose is that as a bit of a transition measure, we allow possibilities of, there's a small mistake on the slide there, sorry for that, it should be interconnector participation, but also implicit participation of cross-border capacities. And lastly, on a more higher level, really the European level, we are also definitely already looking with great interest in the fast-track approval rules for capacity mechanisms. So also there, we already mentioned this with the colleagues earlier from the European Commission. So it's a very interesting discussion and ongoing work that's there. So really interesting and curious how that will turn out. But what we also need is that we see that capacity mechanisms need to be able to adapt to changing circumstances. For example, only a couple of years ago, we had the energy crisis following the Ukraine war, and the high prices that we witnessed there had a big influence on how some capacity mechanisms are developed. And we need to be able to continue taking that into account and to adapt if certain geopolitical events pop up. And yeah, I think I just want to conclude that it's important to keep exploring opportunities and possibilities for a streamlined design and more efficiency.
Thank you very much. We now have 10 minutes for questions. This time, maybe I would start from the questions we receiving online via Slido. So the first question, or the one that's received most votes so far, does ENTSO-E have a common position on how to avoid inefficient overlaps between capacity mechanisms and non-fossil flexibility support schemes? Anybody would take that?
Okay. So I mean, it's something that we've been looking into. And we have been discussing whether sequentially it makes more or less impact having one or the other before. And I mean, we don't have, since there is no much experience, we are not conclusive there. What we have also been looking into is that there exists also even the possibility that could be explored of trying to jointly allocate both in the same mechanism. So incorporating also flexibility services, so to say, in the capacity mechanism option. But we are still discussing these other alternatives, and we are even working in another in another domain of more linked to storage and demand response as well. And I guess we will come with with more ideas or maybe even a conclusion, hopefully, on this aspect that we continue thinking about.
Thank you, Javier. I think it would be interesting to know also from the European Commission later in the panel how they see this, because the point is also touched in the draft CSAF framework. Next question, which now has become the most voted one. What guardrails will be put in place to prevent fossil fuel lock-in that run counter to climate goals with CRM contracts to gas plants of 15, 17 years? I guess that's a question that anyone else in the panel later could reply, but what is the view of ENTSO-E on this? Go ahead.
I believe there's actually multiple ways to answer this question. The first one is a calibration part, where we need to, before setting up a capacity auction, you need to assess how much capacity you need and whether there's an actual need also on the long term to have capacities for 15 or 17 years, as was put in the question. So that's a very first important step, that you actually can identify the need for capacity contract on the very long term. So that's one thing, so that, well, you have a lock-in effect, but it's a lock-in effect that's actually needed, and that it's fair if you need the capacity for such a sustained period of time. It can be justified. And then secondly, and again, talking from the Belgian experience, if you do obtain contracts for such long periods, then one possibility is including a waiver or a declaration that you will commit to CO2 neutrality goals by the end of that contract, and that by the end of that lifetime you will be CO2 neutral. So also there are possibilities to leverage that. You get the developer of these new capacities, they get the benefits of the stable revenues from a capacity mechanism, but in return they also have to really sign a declaration that they will commit to climate goals.
And just kind of to add, I think we can look at things such as run hour limits. So it's, from a climate perspective, it's not the existence of capacity, it's the use of that capacity in an unabated way that really matters. So that's the first issue. And I think secondly, from a climate perspective, it's important to kind of note that a stable electricity system can enable more electrification of society, which is ultimately cleaner than having other parts of society not electrify and continue to rely on fossil fuels. So there should be an overall kind of total system view, whereby if the electricity system is stable, then it can help to clean industry, to clean transport and things like that. So actually, not just look at the unit's nameplate capacity itself, but how much it's actually used, and if the system in that situation can actually enable the economy to decarbonize more quickly. Thank you.
Thank you all. I see some questions that are maybe not directly addressed to ENTSO-E speakers. So, for instance, the next one, would a regional approach of capacity mechanism be in line with the EU regulation? Maybe we'll hear the Commission opinion later. So next in line, you mentioned reliability option as an option to control costs. How would you define a reliability option for storage, which looks at price volatility and not peak price? Want to take that, Kendall? Thank you.
It's actually a very interesting question, particularly from the Belgian perspective, because when we initially designed the Belgian CRM, we had a reliability option also for storage capacities. However, based on some re-evaluation also from the European Commission, right now the latest view is that the reliability option does no longer apply to storage capacities, also to foster more storage capacities, because they are a very interesting type of technology in a healthy capacity mix. So currently in Belgium, we do not have a reliability option anymore for storage. However, we used to have one in the past, and also there the design is relatively, it's a bit complex actually, because for a reliability option, you really look at the absolute price values. Whereas if you look into it more into detail, for storage options, they don't make money based on these absolute price values. They make money based on price fluctuations and the spread that happens throughout the day between the prices. So these absolute values of for example, the day-ahead market, they're only a possible proxy for the revenues that storage capacities can make. So it's a bit of a tricky topic to then say that you can simply apply a reliability option to storage technologies simply based on these day-ahead prices, for example. But on the other hand, we must also take into account simplification and making capacity mechanisms not too complex. Because if you want to apply a reliability option in different ways to different capacities, to different technologies, depending on how they function on the energy market, it's a slippery slope that makes capacity mechanisms even more complex than they are already right now. So if you do want to apply reliability options also to storage technologies, then my personal take would be to still use the day-ahead price, at least as a proxy to determine their windfall profits if necessary. But again, with the disclaimer that based on the latest evaluation of the European Commission, that reliability options for storage technologies was no longer applicable, at least in Belgium.
Thank you, Camille. Maybe one last question from online and then one in the room. Just a second. So the question is, given that cross-border transmission is constrained by interconnector capacity, how is this limitation taken into account when designing capacity mechanisms? Javier, you can take this.
Yeah, so I think there are two answers here. So first of all, so capacity is taken into account when assessing the adequacy concerns in the ERA and both the NRA. So with TSOs, we have to take into account contributions of interconnections to adequacy when assessing whether there is an adequacy concern or not. And the other part of the question would be, once that you have the adequacy concern and you implement a capacity mechanism, how you take into account the limited value of cross-zonal capacity, and that also there is a methodology which is called maximum entry of capacity that we have to run to assess which is the maximum contribution or participation that we can take into account or we can accept in the capacity mechanism when it comes to cross-border participation. So in a nutshell, there is two steps. So one, first of all, in the adequacy concern, that by methodology, we take into account contributions of interconnections to adequacy. And then once you have the adequacy concern identified, how to integrate cross-border participation in your capacity mechanism is based on the calculated maximum entry of capacity, also following this methodology. Yeah.
Thank you. That was a gentleman in the room.
Thank you. Good morning, citizens. My name is Angelos Harlaftis, Epafos Advisors. There is a question for us who are not experts as you are. When you say capacity measures, it's a general term. Is it more defined? Is there a definition, a strict definition about what does mean capacity mechanisms?
I would say, I mean, from regulatory perspective, I don't know whether this is the exact definition, but capacity mechanism, there is a whole taxonomy, whether you can make a strategic reserve or you do a market-wide capacity mechanism. So it is, I would say, in the 2019 943, I think it is where it first appears. And I mean, in European legislation. And I mean, it is a broad concept maybe to make reference to measures that you can put in place to try to foster the
the installation of new capacity is in the system. Whether you do it by a market-wide mechanisms, which could be an auction, or by a strategic reserve, which would be pointing some technologies to be out of the market. It is true that there is a lot of flexibility there, which is also needed because there are different situations, different challenges that need to be tackled by the different member states. I don't know. You're going to complement?
Yeah, maybe to add, I agree that there's like a wide diversity on what can be understood maybe under capacity mechanisms, but I do think that on the website of the European Commission, there's a dedicated page about capacity mechanisms with a lot of useful information, and that provides a bit of a general definition. So hopefully that can already provide a general framework to explain a bit more on the different topics that we're talking about here today.
Thank you. And please, Matt, one last question or comment to this.
Thanks a lot. So thank you, ENTSO-E colleagues, for the helpful work on this paper. Just one observation or kind of question. Just on a lot of these things, I think we can quickly agree on principles at a reasonably high level. I mean, but the real challenge is coming up with practical solutions that put them into practice. Right? I mean, one example would be the first question you had on how do you join up the flexibility and capacity procurement in an efficient way. Just to indicate that I think work on the detailed practical implementation will be very valuable if possible, and there must be lessons learned. We've been living with ancillary services along with capacity mechanisms for years now, so there should be some good lessons to draw on. But on that and on other questions where we need to go from principle to detail. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Matt, and indeed, and we are willing to continue with this as a starting point to discuss these practical solutions and find them. Yeah.
Okay, and with that one, I think we arrived to the coffee break. We're already 4 minutes late, but we can still take 10 minutes or so. So we will be back at 10:35, for panel discussion with the Commission, ENTSO-E, again, the Ministry of Climate and Environment in Poland, and then we have Compass Lexicon and RAP as well as participants. So back at 10:35. Okay.
Thank you. Welcome back from the coffee break. My name is Anna Pellegata. I'm the convener of the Policy and Communication Group of ENTSO-E. So it's my pleasure to moderate this first panel discussion of the morning. First of all, let me introduce the panelists, for the speakers for the panel. You already heard from a couple of them already in the previous presentations before the coffee break, but I'll introduce them again just in case someone joined in presence or online just now. So we have Melpomene Schiappa, Legal and Policy Officer from the European Commission in DG Ener, Adrian Kondaczeski, the Director of the Department of International Affairs in the Polish Ministry of Climate and Environment. In order, we have Fabian Rock, Executive Vice President and Head of the European Energy Practice at Compass Lexicon, Bram Kleijs, from Senior Advisor at the Regulatory Assistance Project, welcome, and then Javier Barrantes, ENTSO-E's convener of the Working Group Market Design and Renewable Energy Sources. So thank you again all for being here today. So just to start and kick off the panel discussion, we heard previously from ENTSO-E, the European Commission, as well as the Polish presidency, but we now want to hear a little bit more from the audience. So we would like again to kick off the panel with a Slido question, which I think will be projected very shortly with the QR code. So both for the ones of you who are joining us in the room and online, we ask you to again, use a QR code to answer this question. So as more member states look to develop and implement capacity mechanisms by 2030, do you believe that the current regulatory framework is fit for purpose? You have three options: yes, partially, and no. We'll give everyone a few minutes to answer, just to set the tone for the conversation that will follow. Okay, we see the first answers coming in. We give a few minutes. Okay, so I think an overwhelming majority is going for partially, so that's good, I think, and bad news for everyone. The yes is growing a little bit, but okay, I think that more or less we're set on partially. So to just start with our panelists, I would ask you to quickly share a couple of words to react to the answer. So especially in light of the renewed focus on energy security. So we've heard before, Adrian, as well, you mentioned that coming from the council. Can you share your take on whether the current framework is enough, you believe, to address member states' adequacy concerns, especially taking into account the electricity market design developments and what will come next in terms of the stated framework, which we mentioned earlier? Maybe we go really a couple of words for each. Pomini, if you want to start.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. Thank you. Okay, so not too bad personally. So it shows that the capacity mechanisms are an instrument that it's an important instrument on, and it's good to see that the framework that is out there, that it's considered as a framework that can be used, and it's helpful for the capacity mechanism and to be an effective tool for the member states. Of course, yeah, it's partially, so there's still room for improvement and for discussions. So on your question, should I dive into the reform, or you want?
No, we have a question later, so
okay.
Maybe we do a first round.
Yeah,
Adrian.
No, I fully share the sentiment of the poll. I think that of course, the regulatory framework is there. Member states can use it, and they do more often. But of course, I would highlight the word partially there, because I think some simplification rules are needed, and additional guidance from the Commission and regulators is needed as well. So I think it's a not bad answer, but we still have room for improvement.
Okay, thanks. Work in progress. Fabian?
Yes, good morning. And for someone who's been working for 2 decades on capacity mechanisms, I think this is a very important step forward, in the sense that they are recognized now as a structural part of the market design. But I'd like to echo what's been said before by Matt. What's very important is the details and the concrete, trade-offs in the implementation. And in my experience working, on the ground with TSOs, regulators, there's still a number of, areas where we can come up with more precise recommendations, and I'll mention a few of them.
Thank you. Ram?
Yes, thank you. I think there's always room for improvement. That's clear. So the partial is definitely the most correct answer, I think, to give here. So happy to think through the details. I think your question is actually, is this fit for purpose to respond to the concerns about energy security and reliability, which is, of course, very live right now. And in a quick reaction to that, I would say this is, of course, an important part of solving that puzzle. It's obviously not the only one. There's other and maybe more suitable, depending on what you want to achieve, measures that member states can take. And one that I would highlight that is not specific to capacity mechanisms is the issue of availability, which the ENTSO-E paper also discusses. But I think that's become apparent to be one of the major issues, also seeing the results or the preliminary conclusions from the Spanish government yesterday about the blackout, where availability or delivering on commitments is a major thing, and that's not specific to capacity mechanisms. It's a part of other market design features as well. But I think that's one where we need to work on.
Thank you, Bram. And to close, Javier?
Yeah, thank you. No, I think it's the best answer you can always give, right? Partially. So in the middle, always the virtues in the moderation, and I completely agree. I mean, the good thing also from our point of view is that the tendency is good. I mean, we have had a good improvement recently within the AMDR, recognizing capacity mechanism as a feature of the market, and and the ongoing discussions we think they provide room for hope of still improving the EU regulatory framework. So I mean, still work to do, but promising scenario, I would say.
Okay, thank you. So now we get into the, let's say, more detailed debate. Some of the points were already raised in the presentation this morning, so we'll try to push the conversation one step further, starting with, let's say, the institution's view. As we know, the electricity market design reform introduced already some key updates, which we highlighted as well this morning. We know that it removed the temporary label to capacity mechanisms. There was a request to update the ERA methodology and the request to enhance through the, let's say, stated framework to streamline the adoption of capacity mechanism by member states. So starting from from the Commission, so we wait for the CSAF publication in the next few days. We already mentioned, Matt, I think already mentioned this morning, also the fact that the CSAF will still be complementary to the existing framework. But can you share a little bit more on your view on how the EMD development and the new CSAF will help balance the national, let's say, design specificities for capacity mechanisms, along with the need to, again, streamline and fasten the approval process of capacity mechanisms. If you can share a few words to reassure, especially the most concerned member states.
Yes, of course. Maybe before I start discussing the framework, to answer a question that was from the audience before about what is actually capacity mechanism, just to clarify that there is a definition in the electricity regulation that a capacity mechanism is a measure to ensure the achievement of the necessary level of resource adequacy by remunerating resources for the availability. So it's a payment for capacity to be available, and it excludes measures relating to ancillary services or congestion management. So it's a measure really for adequacy, to address adequacy concerns. It's an availability payment for those capacities. Now, coming back to the framework, as mentioned, framework came with the Clean Energy Package 2019, initially there as a temporary measure or last resort, or this, the thinking was different at the time. In the electricity market design reform last year, deleted references to the temporary, so now capacity mechanisms become a structural component of the electricity market. That was what now the co-legislators also wished. And that was one of the main changes that the EMD brought into the capacity mechanism section. And then the ones that we talked about, the streamlining, the report and the proposals. And then, as I mentioned also in the beginning in the speech, the idea behind those changes is exactly to increase the flexibility for the member states. By doing that, by offering now the possibility to use the additional central reference scenario, which gives more flexibility to the member states to consider the national specificities, be that because something has changed in their planning, in their targets about renewables, or the electrification is not stepping up as it was initially planned. So this will allow to take into account the national specificities, and also other options offered by the report, such as as we said, the possibility to use the adequacy metrics that Acer will prepare, or the possibility to do the assessment for specific target years. So all these are maybe, they're not the one big massive simplification, but they are small steps that will make the whole process, possibly more, give more flexibility to the member state. And at the same time, the CSAF, so which comes together with the report, is the proposal. As you said, it's a complementary. It's an option for the member states to use it. It's not an obligation. So if you have seen the version that was published for public consultation, it has a list of requirements that if the member states decide to follow this target model, the approval should be much swifter, as Matt said, the idea is no discussion if possible, but basically even if there's discussion, the idea is to shorten much more the time that is needed for the assessment. So basically the CSAF will bring, I would say, the need for simplification, the need for a bit of harmonization through that. So I think the balance comes from there. On the one side, you have the member states now, the possibility for them to use different scenarios, different metrics, and if they decide to use those, the approval will be much faster. So I think that the balance comes from the combination of these two. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. Adrian, from the member states, we know that the topic has been clearly covered also at council level. You mentioned this already this morning. Besides from the regional approach, which will delve a little bit more into details, do you have anything to add from the member states' perspective on the upcoming framework? And if you could share a couple more words on, maybe the differences among the member states on both the framework and the regional approach as well.
Sure. Thanks a lot. I've as I said, we had a discussion during lunchtime on capacity mechanisms and regional approach to them with ministers, and the note that we prepared explaining the concept of regional capacity mechanism, but also it was based on the input from the power sector. We had colleagues from Electric presenting their position, which was very good. I'm very positive about the outcomes of the discussion. I think the two takes I got from the lunch was that first, I think there's growing understanding among member states that the capacity mechanisms will be needed in the coming years more broadly. And many more member states are trying to embark on that system and try to introduce capacity mechanisms as a safety net. And if this is the case, then we need to simplify the rules for applying the instrument. And I'm happy to hear that it's already happening, and the Commission is working also very hard with member states to make that happen. So that's a good thing. And many ministers said that because in principle it's a very complex regulatory tool, so we don't have to add another burden to that. And if that could be simplified and facilitated, then we should do that. And the other take that I got from the lunch is that if we are, as member states, going to implement capacity mechanism more broadly, we should then aim to make them more efficient. And one of the idea is to try to seek to complementarities between different capacity mechanisms models that are implemented in many member states. And one of those one of those ideas to seek for complementarities is to try to establish this regional approach to capacity mechanism. So we could like bundle a handful of countries together and try to seek for common interests and perhaps try to pool resources around the tool so that we could share the benefits of the system among member states, but also share the costs among countries participating in the system, so that the costs for individual end consumers are lower. So that was around the lunchtime. And when it comes to the framework, we will see what will eventually be published. But I have a feeling that on ERA, I think if we want to go ahead in some sort of harmonization or trying to implement a more broader system, we need to decide on having a wider assessment as well. So I think ERA, the updated ERA, could be a good step forward in that direction. And on CSAF, I think that depending on the outcome, I wish that the instrument could encourage member states to go in that avenue, so that they could try to seek for complementarities between systems and maybe try to use the same tool, but in a more coordinated way. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. Now we move from again, we heard from the institution's perspective, we're moving more towards the, let's say, industry and civil society. So we are taking a step back and looking at the broader resource adequacy toolbox. We have talked a lot today about capacity mechanisms, which are the main focus of the event, but there are one element among several others. And so with the Commission aiming at to deepen the market integration, the design interaction across all these tools becomes even more crucial and critical. So my first question goes to Fabian. What's your take on the current capacity mechanisms design, especially with regards to the objectives of market integration and support to investments in clean flexibility? And how do you see the long-term contracts like PPA, CFDs, and other market-based mechanisms complementing capacity mechanisms? And last piece of the question is whether you see also risks about price distortion or anything like that, and measures to instead avoid them.
Right, many things in your questions. Let me perhaps step back and start from the question of what's people expect from capacity mechanism. And as you said, it's sometimes very different if you talk to an industry person and if you talk to a government person. On the public side of things, as we've just discussed, capacity mechanisms are fundamentally an insurance policy, right? It's the idea that it will ensure the adequacy and therefore in macro terms that the lights stay on or contribute to having the lights staying on. From an industry perspective, very often capacity mechanisms are seen as a tool to support either investment or to make sure that the missing money of some of the assets that are necessary in the system is there, is remunerated. And what comes with it is a focus on the de-risking element of capacity mechanism, if you take the developer perspective. And this is where some of the design elements that we have discussed are super important. You mentioned the duration of the contracts. And this is where also we have to think about the trade-offs. There was this issue that was mentioned between the lock-in of some long-term contracts, and on the other hand, the de-risking effect of capacity mechanism, which in turn can potentially reduce the cost of capital, cost of financing, and reduce the cost of to some extent, the transition. So it's not an easy trade-off from a macroeconomic point of view, but there have been a number of studies on that to try and optimize this trade-off. And very often the answer is that it depends also on the level of capex intensity. So how much capex you have to put on the table, because this is where you have the connection with the positive effects in terms of cost of capital and reduction in terms of total system costs. Now, let me perhaps pick up on the other part of your question, which was on the toolbox in general and on the interplay with the broader set of issues at play with security of supply. So we've just done a study on this, and as we all know, the security of supply issue is multi-dimensions, more complex than before, and capacity mechanism, as the ENTSO-E report makes clear, have to adapt to this reality. And I think if we look ahead at the next generation of capacity mechanisms, what I observe working with TSOs and regulators is that these mechanisms have to, in a way, be designed together with the other instruments that are there. So that was mentioned previously, but flexibility mechanisms, as well as a broader procurement framework for clean technologies, including CFDs, etc., and support mechanisms for batteries, for instance, or demand response. So what that means in practice is that you have a very simple problem in theory that's actually extremely complex in practice. The simple problem is, do you choose one mechanism to do the flexibility contracting and the adequacy contracting, or do you use two mechanisms? And it may be that there are pros and cons, but my experience is that it depends very much on the situation you are in a specific country. So I think this is one of the areas where more guidance could be provided, and obviously I don't have the time here, but very happy to continue with those interested on this. It depends on whether you already have one of these mechanisms, and therefore you start from a position that's different from a white sheet of paper. It depends also on the specific system needs, how they interplay. And it depends also on whether the pool of resources that can provide either of these two services, adequacy or flexibility, is disjoint or largely overlapping. And that will depend very much on the specific systems that you are looking at. That's why, it's very hard to give you one-size-fits-all solution. And maybe I'll conclude, just one final point on this. In your questions, there was also the question whether a capacity mechanism can contribute to an efficient transition and decarbonization. And I'd say yes, certainly. Obviously, if they are well designed, we have many examples that capacity mechanisms have been instrumental in supporting efficient investment, in the sense that if you look at demand response, if you look at batteries, for instance, they have been, getting the lion's share of some of the recent auctions in capacity mechanisms, and that's a proof that capacity mechanism can also support innovation. If they are well designed, they can lead to a level playing field where new technologies emerge. So I'll stop here.
So thank you, but it's very interesting to hear that in a moment where we talk more about harmonization and sharing methodology, etc., the national specificities that you brought up is still something to take largely into account. Thanks. So Bram, you have raised previously in previous occasion concerns about the risk of technology lock-in effects. We also received a question from the audience earlier on, so this is the opportunity to talk a little bit more about that. So in your opinion, what regulatory principles can help avoid that? And then can the capacity mechanism framework evolve more to support flexibility, support schemes without risks of becoming overly complex, or do you see other risks there?
Yeah, thank you. The last part of your question is the most tricky one, I think, and without becoming overly complex. So that's the challenge, and sometimes I feel like we're in these discussions try to achieve everything that we previously achieved from the energy-only market now with the capacity markets, and that's going to be a bit difficult, I think. So. But it's a very fair concern, and we've indeed pointed to that concern in the past. And I think your own report or paper also refer to it. About 4.5%, I think, is what you mentioned, of current capacity market contracts capacity goes to the demand side flexibility. I think Acer said in 2022, 85% of capacity under contracts went to fossil generators, gas or coal. And so that's, of course, a concern, especially given that we have, in many cases, especially for new resources, long contract durations. For existing resources, that's different, but new investments tend to be, if they are capex intensive, and gas power plants definitely are, contract durations of 10, 15 years long. If you offset that to the ambition to have zero emissions in the power sector anywhere between 2035, 2040, and we're 2025 today, that is a clear and apparent problem. So dealing with that is going to be very important, and I'm glad that this was a focus on the ENTSO-E paper. I think there's several solutions to improve the take-up of non-fossil flexibility in capacity mechanisms. But we should, of course, not forget that many of the solutions also lay outside of the capacity markets, and just improving the electricity markets themselves, and making sure that demand-side flexibility, aggregate demand-side flexibility, can participate there properly. And I think the market reform that was concluded last year does take important steps forward. Implementing that would be a huge step forward, specifically for demand-side flexibility, but of course also the long-term contracts that Fabien talked about also need to be designed in a way that supports demand-side flexibility. And I mention it here because we tend to, in these discussions, lose sight of that. Also, in assessing flexibility needs, the regulation does say that we first need to say if the markets cannot be improved to achieve the flexibility needs or non-fossil flexibility target that a member state sets. But then, of course, going to your question inside the capacity mechanisms, there's many things that you can do to avoid the fossil lock-in that we're seeing today, but an important one will be doing something about contract length. We in Europe tend to have long contracts for gas power plants and capacity mechanisms, also for coal and lignite. But that is not a standard. If you look at capacity markets in US, where we have worked extensively, you do see that much shorter contract lengths are also applied. And PGM is a classic example with 1-year contracts. Almost no US capacity mechanism market has contract lengths over 10 years. Most are under 8 years. So reducing the contract length is, I think, an obvious way to go. I know it's not a perhaps popular one among some, but it would seem to be a very important one. And then next, of course, make sure that demand-side flexibility can properly participate in capacity markets. Recent auctions, as Fabien said, have been successful. We do still have a very big gap to fill to get a better representation of demand-side flexibility in capacity markets. And that will involve looking at derating factors, but also things like the minimum threshold to participate in capacity markets. So we've seen in the electricity market that the electricity market reform has reduced the thresholds to 100 kilowatts, for example, that NEMOs now have to design products for in day-ahead and intraday markets. But that hasn't been translated to a capacity market design, which would, however, seem logical to also do it there. So I think there's ways to go, and then we also talked about including specific requirements for capacities that get a capacity contract, and the Belgian capacity market design does require a commitment to go net zero. We'll have to see what that delivers, of course. I think the Spanish capacity market in that sense was maybe even more. There's always evolution of thinking. As far as I know, the proposal still includes the requirement for new capacity to be net zero from the start. If you want to get a capacity mechanism, that seems to be a way to go and avoid a lot of the discussions that I imagine might happen in the Belgian case. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Javier, you have, as a host, you have the last question. So we saw already this morning the presentation into the key aspects of ENTSO-E position on capacity mechanisms, which I think to which you contributed heavily. So first of all, do you have anything to add? Especially, we heard a little bit about the challenges of cross-border participation. Do you want to share anything more vis-a-vis the regional approach which we discussed? And then the second part of the question is more related to the trends that ENTSO-E is observing across Europe. Do you think that we are going towards a greater convergence on capacity mechanisms design, or are member states instead taking a different, let's say, paths?
Thank you very much. Very, very good questions. I will start with the second one because also I think it affects the first one. So, yeah, I mean, harmonization also always it is good. It's something general that we always say because it facilitates, in the European context, maybe the participation in different mechanisms by market participants, etc. The reality with the energy transition, as we were also pointing out before, is that it brings many diverse challenges. So it is very difficult to find a harmonized capacity mechanism design that can really effectively cope with all the different challenges that the different systems are already facing, that will face in the future, that we may discover also in the coming years. So. It is not that we don't see a trend, but it is difficult to really have to really progress at least in the short term in that direction. We in our paper, because we being an European report, it is important to bring also an European perspective. We try to find some general aspects that can be common base, so to say, to almost every kind of capacity mechanism design that could be harmonized or streamlined at European level. But given the diverse system needs and challenges and reality in the different member states, it is difficult to say that we are close to a one-size-fits-all mechanism. And then, having that in mind, regionalization, cross-border participation. Of course, you don't need this harmonization. You can implement it, and still, it is proving to be very complex with many design details that, for sure, in the next panel, I think it will be discussed by the panelists. And when it comes to regionalization, in my understanding, it would require a level of harmonization also in the terms of the challenges faced in the region where you want to establish that regionalized capacity mechanism. So if you find a region that face similar challenges, I think it is doable. But I think the challenge is maybe finding that region where the challenges faced are common enough to be able to establish that regional capacity mechanism. Okay.
Thank you so much. I think we have a few more minutes for questions from the audience, so either in person or online. I already see a few. How many can we take, Marco? I leave it to you.
I don't know, maybe let's start with 2 or 3 from the room and then switch to the ones online.
Thanks very much. First, I have one question a little bit on this idea that it's really different in every member state and there aren't similar problems. At least my observation is it's easy to overstate the differences. Everybody has a challenge of integrating higher levels of renewables, pretty much. Of course, some people have hydro resources or things that change a bit the picture, but it's overall a similar challenge and a similar challenge on cost of energy and a similar challenge of phasing out fossil fuels. So I wonder if that concern about the national differences can potentially be overstated, and feel free to comment on that. The other thing I wanted to do while I have the microphone is reply to the question this morning about whether the EU framework prevents these regional approaches that Poland is proposing. I would say personally I would view this regional idea very positively, and I don't think there's anything in the framework that prevents it, certainly not in the state aid rules. We already have one example of a state aid decision on 2 jurisdictions, which is the Irish capacity mechanism. So there's no reason why we couldn't, I think, approve broader regional measures if member states want. The only thing where I would raise a bit of caution on there is, at least in some of the public statements I've seen from Poland, there's a discussion about whether, as part of this regional capacity mechanism approach, we should look again at market coupling rules and potentially change the system that we have where flows across borders are based on megawatt hour price differences only. I don't see a good reason to do that. I mean, I think you just add complexity and reduce efficiency probably if you try to add a capacity element to market coupling. So, and I don't think that's necessary to efficiently join these capacity mechanisms together across borders. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So maybe to the first question, Fabian or Javier, who wants to take it? You are the ones.
Yeah, maybe very good questions, Matt, and perhaps on your challenge regarding the specificity of issues by member states, I'd say the fundamental question is not just on what are these policy challenges, but on the potential set of resources that can fulfill the needs. And we all know it's very different if you are in a country where the adequacy or flex issue is primarily driven by a lot of, for instance, solar, a lot of wind, or on the supply side, if you are in a country where there is a lot of hydro, which provides the medium to long-term flexibility. So the differences are not just in terms of, I would say, policy objectives or system operation challenges. They're also embedded, I think, in some fundamental electricity system differences. But I take your point that that can be overplayed sometimes, and maybe to dwell on what is a fundamental issue with cross-border participation. I think we should distinguish on the one hand side the policy issues, on the other hand the operational issues. I think on the policy side, the fundamental issue, to name it, is to trust each other's, and what that means is that there needs to be a policy agreement at policy level. On what do you do in situations of joint issues, coincident system stress. On the operational side, I think that was mentioned on the previous roundtable by EDIA colleagues. When you start working on a TSO agreement, there are a number of issues, quite complex, that start to appear. But I think these are different types of issues. There is, to me, the fundamental policy level, and there is the operational level, which is not to be underestimated, where there are a lot of complex issues as well.
Maybe just to add, I think you are making the point already, but the starting point is also very different, and the system needs and the system challenges, they change a lot. There are many different systems, realities. There are systems with congestion issues that they cannot integrate any capacity at any point in the network, but in several, but it's only in some of them. There are other systems that are very weakly interconnected with the European continent. So I mean, I don't think this is an overstatement. I would say the opposite. I mean, it would be an underestimation. Think that we are all at the same starting point. Of course, we all have the same objective, but the path that we have to follow it differs a lot, and hence the need of having different tools to make the same goals. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So we only have a few minutes. Maybe we pack the 3 questions in the room and then we see how to allocate through the speakers. So please go ahead.
Thank you. Robert Dietz, R2B Energy Consulting. So the development and the discussion goes ahead central capacity markets across Europe. Also the CSAF is promoting central instruments, if I get it right, the annex of the CSAF. So I'm a bit concerned about the cost of the central CRMs for the consumers. There are huge uncertainties regarding development of electricity consumption, EV offtake, flexibility of EVs, of heat pumps, etc. So don't you think that over-procurement and inefficiencies will be an inherent element of the central capacity market, also because of the naturally given risk aversion of the central planner of these capacity markets, compared to decentral approaches, which are more at the descending ladder, I think, in the European context. So, thank you.
Yeah, it's actually comparing a bit the statements of the panelists, especially on the harmony, let's say the regional CRMs. If I understand well, the idea would be to have a regional auction for capacity, but the implication of that is that bids can be compared between countries. And the second implication of that, and that's then I think also related to Bram's comment, is that your product and your penalties and all the different many rules that you might have actually need to be identical, as maybe exaggerated, but at least to a very similar level. And then indeed I can use my experience in developing CRMs that these elements cannot necessarily be identical, because the way that prices are bid into an auction depend not only on the product that you're auctioning, but also on the secondary circumstances, like risks for connection, timeline, penalty level, stuff like that. So my question is, can this be considered as, I would say, a more broader target model, or what are the preconditions before we can move towards such a regional mechanisms?
Thank you again, Angelos Karlaftis. I'm very glad that I see a young generation beginning to discuss for regulatory frameworks. I hope you'll be old as me to still discussing, because it's very early to discuss for implementation of a more precise model on this level of discussion. It's regulatory frameworks are control and security levels. Usually you have to be directed, as we call it, we used to call it at the ICT science, as code of conduct before the regulation. Because I see that you are imitating, as you usually do in the European continent, the USA models, which are older, but I don't think that these are good for us anymore. So we have to study better other models, like in China, which is very good in innovation. We have to study very carefully what they are doing, because they are going to lead the world as they look. And we have to look not to the old competitive markets, but also to the new who are coming, so that we can construct and build our own regulatory frameworks in the future. And also, I think it's a mistake also always speaking about the market. The market is good. Me, I'm a market guy. But we have to have a level of a basement for the energy structures we are building for the good of the citizens, because Europe is based on the citizens. This is our tradition, and so we should keep it. So the base must be, as you as regulators, you should think the basement to be a liberated framework for all the citizens, and up over there we build the market environments. And I think you are very bureaucratic thinking, because you are losing the hardware part. You are discussing the contracts, which is the software part, without thinking the hardware part. I'm going to speak later on for this. Thank you, lady.
I'm sorry. We have just a few seconds to answer. Is there a question?
Yes. Which is based on the battery, because the thing is the batteries. The flexibility and everything, I think, is the battery thing. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, who wants to take the question? I would say maybe Pamela, you can handle the first one on the decentralization and the impact on cost or risk of procurement and the impact on consumers. Maybe Adrian, Bram, the second on the regional approach, and then on the broader, let's say, market approach, whoever feels to answer.
Thank you. Indeed, I mean, the regulation does not specify what it gives the possibility not to have a market-wide capacity mechanism or strategic reserve. These are the two types of mechanisms that are envisaged there. So, how to avoid the excessive cost for consumers? I think, and the risk of over-procurement. I think that can be achieved, and it should be achieved normally through the resource adequacy assessments, be that in the ERA or the National Resource Adequacy Assessment. It's there where it's identified what is the gap, what is the need, and then when it comes to the implementation by the member state, when it comes to decide that the volume to be procured in the auctions. It's also there very critical to see what is really needed for the system, and that's also why the ERA and also the ERA methodology highlight the need to consider for example, the cross-border exchanges, the cross-zonal exchanges, because it's very important to see what can we get from the neighbors, what not, and in order to have the volume procured that is actually needed and avoid having excessive cost for the consumers, which are the ones to pay for the state aid. And maybe one word also on the regional capacity mechanisms, just to indeed clarify that the electricity regulation does not have specific rules. That means that it does not exclude them per se. So it's up to the member states if they wish to come up with a proposal of a regional capacity mechanism. Of course, we see a few different challenges that would have to be discussed in the process. I don't know, cost sharing, how would that take place? Or in case there would be, a regional supply shortage or grid connection that was mentioned. So there are challenges, but the regulation does not exclude the possibility for the member states to do it. So it's it's just a matter to discuss how it can be done.
Thank you so much, Adrian. If you want to comment on the second question.
Yes, thanks. But maybe I'll start with the Matt's comment on the market coupling versus additional regional capacity mechanisms. I think it all depends on the end goal. If more market integration and market coupling can result in more safety net across the region, then it's fine. But if not, then we should then think of applying additional measures, possibly in capacity mechanisms at the regional level to safeguard the stability of the systems. And I think the eventual flows of electricity throughout the regions, it's a secondary question. And then on the regional approach and the challenges, of course, I mean, we are not that advanced in establishing a regional cooperation on capacity mechanism, but we do have experiences in cross-border exchange and works with our neighbors on capacity mechanism, and they do participate in our actions. So I think in principle it is possible to go ahead this avenue. Of course, I mean, there are multiple challenges on the way. And multiple preconditions, as for example, enough capacities at the borders that could be available to maintain the electricity flows. But I think if there's a sentiment across the region that we have similar challenges and there's a huge generation capacity gap that is happening across the region, then I think having a right instrument to address the challenge across the region is possible. And if that could also save us some money, if we introduce those measures at the regional level, then even better.
Thank you. Bram, do you have anything to complement?
Sure. I mean, the question about the markets and which ones to follow is interesting. I think we should always learn from evolution in the US and in Europe and China, elsewhere. I think we always need to keep in mind what we want to achieve and try to minimize costs for citizens, for consumers, households, as well as businesses. So trying to avoid higher costs will, of course, be very much influenced by the extent to which we manage to avoid system stress events. So just wanted to bring back the point that I made earlier about making sure that resources are available and deliver on their commitments, which will require looking at making sure that projects that sign contracts are not ghost projects, and making sure that they are real and will go forward, thinking about penalties that are significant. I hear the point about avoiding that nobody wants to participate in the mechanism, but if the result is that we put the system under stress, that's of course not a great thing. And it will also involve looking at facilitating measures outside of the capacity, maybe even outside of electricity markets. Thinking about Texas, for example, famously a market without a capacity market, which was under very heavy stress during a winter event, which had to do with how the gas system was winterized or not winterized. So we're talking about capacity mechanisms as the answer to system stress and security of supply, but that involves many different aspects inside and outside of capacity mechanisms. And then one last thing, I do think we need to also think through how the volume is determined and who determines that volume that is auctions for capacity mechanisms. How are demand projections determined? Who does that? And so I think in the UK there was an interesting experience of involving external experts to review. There's even a possibility to think through whether an independent system operator and planner should be doing this as opposed to the transmission system owner. I'm probably cursing in the church now, as we say in Flemish, in this house.
Huge topic to feel.
Yeah, very big topic, but it is an important one to potentially avoid over procurement, which comes at a cost. And make no mistake, these policy costs, not only capacity mechanisms, also CFDs, other support mechanisms, will come under increased scrutiny as hopefully energy costs come down. Grid and policy costs will come under scrutiny. So minimizing those will be really important.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we already stole a few minutes from the break, so I thank you again. There will be the opportunity to continue and maybe react even further to some points in the next panel. Thank you again. Marco, when do we reconvene?
Yes, so let's take to 15 minutes coffee break to follow the previous one. So we come back at 11:50.
That are necessary to comply with both state aid rules and sectorial rules. And for that, we needed it also to be sufficiently comprehensive so that all elements of the current framework for capacity mechanisms would be covered. And last but not least, we try to do a tentative steps towards
facilitating the market participation of market players present in more than one member state, so that they would have a facilitated access to several capacity mechanisms, sometimes with the same resources, sometimes with different resources. I'd prefer to also manage expectations on this point, because this had to be balanced also with the fact not to add too much specificity and complexity. We are very far from the level of harmonization, for example, that was undertaken to couple the electricity markets. So yes, we can move to the next slide. In terms of, I'll go through the main requirements that we have been introducing in those target models, but maybe to start with, this checklist of requirements deals with two types of capacity mechanisms, strategic reserves on the one hand, and a central buyer market-wide capacity mechanism on the other hand. We've heard a question earlier from the audience on why do we chose to have models for these two types of capacity mechanism, while there might be indeed some more types of capacity mechanism that might be good ideas to implement, and we don't oppose to that. It's just that we, as I said earlier, built upon the case practice, which currently in the European Union has been mostly about strategic reserve and central buyer market-wide capacity mechanisms. And which explains why we were able to come up with specific designs for those designs, and maybe not for all type of design that may exist in the literature. Starting with one of the very important steps when it comes to state aid assessments, the necessity of the aid. Those target models should, to be approved under the CSAF, rely on the European Resource Adequacy Assessment. So why this requirement was included is mostly because we needed to enable a fast-track approval. And as you know, the European framework, when it comes to national resource adequacy assessment, require national member state to ask for an opinion from ACER to get a feedback on their national resource adequacy assessment methodology. So it takes months so that this opinion can be delivered because of the complexity of resource adequacy assessment. And this did not fit with the possibility to have fast-track approval, which is why we really focus on the European Resource Adequacy Assessment that has all those check and balances in its approval process to being able to exploit the results as soon as they are published. Another important aspect is that all the parameters related to the capacity mechanisms should also be consistent with the assessment of the need, and in particular with this European Resource Adequacy Assessment, to make sure that we have a consistent approach when it comes to for example, the level of capacity procured to address the security of supply challenges. In the next box that you can see in green on the screen, come two requirements that derive strictly from the electricity regulation. In particular, the requirements to have an implementation plan or a market reform plan published and transmitted to the European Commission. This, fortunately, can be anticipated before any capacity mechanism is introduced, so as not to have a delayed approval on those capacity mechanisms. And the second requirement that also derives from the extra regulation is that in the context of market-wide capacity mechanism, member states should first confirm that the design of a strategic reserve has been considered and was not enough to address the security of supply challenges. In the next box at the bottom of the screen, we had several requirements related to eligibility, which from our perspective is one of the crucial elements to make the capacity mechanism function correctly. The first point is that in principle, and that contrary that just afterwards, CMs should be open to all technologies respecting objective and non-discriminatory criteria. And the only exception to that is that the Commission encourage member states to implement environmental criteria that might be stricter than what is asked by the electricity regulation. The fast track framework also allows for that. I've seen a questions earlier in the Slido about this, how ambitious a member state can be in terms of environmental criteria. There is no limitation for that. There is a minimum level of requirement, which is the electricity regulation, and we really encourage member states to go as far as possible. As it was mentioned earlier, some member states chose to limit the procurement of new technologies only to non-fossil technologies. That's possible. Some member states decided to provide preferential contracts without payback obligation, for example, to non-fossil technologies. That's also possible. There is no limitation in terms of as long as this discrimination is based on objective environmental criteria, that can of course be done. A few words on directing factors, which are technical parameters, but for us really crucial parameters enabling fair competition for those schemes that are technology neutral schemes. We actually heard earlier that capacity mechanism needs to be adapted to national specificities, notably because one technology cannot provide the same service in a specific context than that it may in another. Typically, the contribution of solar to adequacy might be lower if we have lots of solar in the system than it may be in a member state with a lower share of solar. So that's typically the kind of thing directing factors try to reflect, and we believe that really this is one of the cornerstones that if they are well calculated, then able to take into account the national specificities while really not touching at other aspects of the designs and really enable to facilitate in this sense harmonization while taking into account those national specificities. Last but not least, it was also mentioned earlier, as you know, the market-wide capacity mechanism should be open to cross-border participation, and we'll probably discuss later that it also comes with its own part of complexity, but that's something that is an obligation derived from the electricity regulation, and so this is also something that exists in this fast-track framework. Next slide, please. So on the proportionality assessment of the age, of course, capacity mechanism contract should be allocated through a competitive bidding process. I think that's nothing new, and we've never seen member states trying to avoid or to contest this requirement. So probably one of the best practice that make consensus. Minimum level of non-availability payment based on current practice. Here again, the idea was to have some requirement which is quite specific with respect to penalties, which, as said earlier by ENTSO-E, is also playing a strong role in how capacity mechanisms are designed, while not pushing for a disproportionate level of penalties, as it was advised by ENTSO-E colleagues earlier. Co-optimization of capacity mechanism and flexibility measures. That's a very in itself, we could spend a whole panel discussing this, and it's a fascinating topic of discussions. The state perspective is that we should avoid overcompensation of beneficiaries, and is in this sense when in a given member state flexibility measures and capacity mechanism coexist, we should take some time to discuss how those two should be coordinated to make sure that there is no overprocurement, no overcompensation, and in some ways as well that they are sufficiently coordinated so that the coexistence does not create a barrier for certain technologies, and in particular for the technologies that can participate to the two services. And in particular, we have in mind that if there is an important time lapse between the two auctions for flexibility on the one hand and capacity mechanism on the other hand, it might be difficult for non-fossil flexibilities to bid at the first auction, while without visibility on what could be the price at the second auction. So there is also requirements to make sure that a sufficient level of coordination between those two types of measure. Another important point from the state practice is the contribution of electricity consumers to the cost of the measure. As said earlier by when stressing the advantages of decentralized capacity mechanism designs, probably one of the most important aspects in this one, to enable implicit demand response to contribute to reduce the need for adequacy capacity through lowering consumptions in hours when scarcity situation occur. And I'll go very quickly through the last box in green to allow the discussion among panelists. What we've seen in all capacity mechanism is that availability is checked based on what is being proposed by capacities in the market. We believe it's a good practice, and that has been also embedded in this fast track framework. And last but not least, strategic reserves should be held outside the market and be dispatched if and only if a situation listed in the electric regulation occur. And that's also something that we've obviously included in this fast track framework. Well, maybe just one last point on this presentation is that we believe that these best practices we came up with will not only facilitate approval for member states that decide to go through this fast track framework, the CSAF, but we believe it also provides a good basis for a member state that would not comply with all those requirements and go through the other stated framework that exists, the SIAG. And if they respect, let's say, 60% of the requirements, we should be able to say that these 60% are fine, and we should not dedicate so much time to discuss them in detail, and instead focus on the 40% that do not respect this fast track framework to discuss and assess whether these alternative design choices that a member state took are also compliant with the framework and capacity mechanism. So that's really to say that this, in our view, brings simplification, of course, for the member state that decide to go through this fast track route, but also for a member state that would like to keep only parts of this of these design aspects when designing a capacity mechanism. Voilà, so that's it in terms of what we had planned to say as an introduction to this discussion. Many thanks.
Thanks a lot, Guillaume. I think that's a perfect introduction for the next panel, where compared to this morning, we will try to dive a bit deeper in the design features, the implementation challenges, and hopefully we can come up with some more precise recommendations, as Matt was suggesting this morning. So first of all, I'm Marco Foresti from the ENTSO-E Secretariat, Market Design Manager, and I had the pleasure to support my colleagues in the elaboration of the policy paper on capacity mechanism. Today with me, we have a wide range of distinguished panelists from academia to institution and industry, well represented. So let me start presenting them from my right. Emma Menegatti, you're a researcher at the Foreign School of Regulation, currently doing a PhD on capacity mechanism, correct?
Yes.
Welcome. Then Guillaume, I've already introduced you, so I will skip you. Zaini Barfi, Head of Policy at SMARTEN, which is the European Association of Flexible Demand. Welcome.
Thank you.
Then we have Gilles Etienne, Adequacy Manager in ELIA, responsible for the design of the Belgian capacity mechanism. Is that correct? Welcome. And last but not least, Ivan Ashes, you're Head of Regulatory Affairs at ENGIE, but you're here as Chair of the Market and Investment Committee of Eurelectric. Welcome. So to break the ice, as we did for the first panel, we are going to launch a Slido poll to see where is the interest of the audience on which specific design features and implementation challenges. So while we pull up the slide, I start reading the question. We're asking, where should the policy efforts on capacity mechanism design focus most in the foreseeable future? And we have 5 options. I can do it otherwise. Procurement costs and cost allocation, improve participation of demand response and storage, ancillary services and locational signals, opportunities for design harmonization at regional level, and lastly, simplifying cross-border participation. Thank you. So I think we've heard them already earlier this morning, all of them, and some more mentioned than others. So let's see. We have only 4 votes so far. So I'll give you 30 seconds. To votes. Seems the ranking is not changing that much. So I'll leave it on the screen as a maybe source of inspiration for the panelists. Well, we can see there's a first place quite clear for improved participation of demand response and storage, which was also one of the main topics of our policy paper. And the other aspects are more or less equally ranked. There's an increased focus on costs, which we've also heard earlier. And then maybe the last point, I guess this is a bit more TSO specific or a concern as system operators. We have maybe more visibility on than others. So I'll leave it on the screen, and I'll ask the panelists to either comment on the poll, or you can also react to the ENTSO-E paper we've presented earlier this morning. So quick 1-2 minutes statement, and then we'll come back with more specific question. Would you like to start?
Yes, I can. So yeah, interesting to see these results. From the FSR side, we've worked a bit on cross-border participation, so I would also have voted 3. And I think number 4 is also quite important because we have an integrated wholesale market. We're pursuing integration and interconnectivity, so there is some rationality and ground to go for more harmonization, and I was happy to hear the word regionalization today. So I think harmonization to go towards integration is also interesting. And on number 5, also it's interesting because we've seen some form of flexibility schemes appearing in the last years with auctions for storage, and they often include requirements on ancillary services and sometimes have locational components. So we see that maybe these instruments are used also to satisfy these needs, but maybe it could be also done through capacity markets a bit more. So yeah, that's it.
Thank you. Guillaume?
Yes, many thanks, and indeed interesting results. Well, maybe a few words on point 1, participation and demand response and storage. We've heard earlier the importance of the accessibility of long-term contracts, and we would definitely support that. Maybe a word again stressing the importance of this parameter, which is the directing factor in enabling the participation of demand response and storage in this capacity mechanism. We may have seen in the past a temptation to say, well, if a technology cannot contribute to 100% of the scarcity situation I may have in my country, I'd rather exclude it. And that's typically went at the expense of demand response and storage. While we believe and we support that it might be best to, instead of valuing 100% of the capacity installed to a battery, for example, able to deliver electricity for 4 hours, direct its capacity, but still allow it to participate to the extent to which it contributes to security of supply. So we really believe that the improved participation of DSR and storage come through these derating factors, which are a parameter which is as essential as it needs expertise to calculate. So we're really happy that in the future, ENTSO-E and ACER will also provide a useful support to calculate those based on Viera to also provide a support to member states in expliciting the value of demand response and storage in addressing adequacy issues.
Thank you, please.
Yeah. Thank you for having me also in this panel. Well, I can obviously say we are happy because we represent the demand response. But this is a good advancement. But of course, when we speak about demand response, it's also seen like implicit one. And I want to make a point here that when we speak about from both flexibility, it has to be implicit and explicit in order to allocate the proper remuneration. And it will not come as a surprise to you that all the market players basically have the primary remuneration market-based. Hence, we say open the market first, and then, of course, CSAF and other mechanism can jump into having a proper remuneration. I can explain that later. Now, when it comes to ERA, of course, we have discussed that, and then obviously flexibility was not part of the modeling in the first place. It was not designed for that purpose. So what we are looking right now, it's also the flexibility needs assessment, which is an initiative actually taken by ACER in that respective, together with ENTSO-E and DSOs. So I would say I only welcome the first response, and hopefully this will be part of the composite of capacity mechanism in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Gilles?
Yeah, I actually think the first point is quite interesting, because I would say that the Belgian CRM is, when it comes to, for example, derating factors, we give a lot of flexibility to demand response to choose their own SLA and to determine their own derating. But still, we see a large hurdle for demand side to participate. And that hurdle is in part based on the complexity of capacity mechanisms. It's quite a big administrative process. You have one person who is responsible for all the energy sourcing in a company. He or she does not necessarily have the time dedicated to fully comprehend what is the implication of signing a capacity contract. So it's my general call in these kinds of panels to also go for simplification, to not overthink it, because in the end, with our 400-page document of rules, which we sometimes try to know by heart, there are a lot of rules which are not relevant for all technologies. One of the reasons that we have 400 pages is because we want to facilitate demand-side management. We need to define baselines and stuff like that. But it's also indirectly a hurdle for them to participate. So we really need to think the question implicit versus explicit participation to security of supply. But also, what can we do to keep it as simple as possible, our capacity mechanisms, not go and cover all the different potential edge cases that can happen in terms of market abuse, so that they can comprehend what is expected from them and they can really estimate what is the level of remuneration that I want.
Thank you, Gilles. Ivan?
A lot have been said before, so I will have to be a bit creative here. No, in terms of, it's true that it's important to remind that capacity markets should be open to demand response and storage. So indeed, it's a good options for them, and we've seen, notably in the Belgian CRM, that indeed batteries are getting capacity contracts. So that's and then what is important are indeed the derating factors, as you mentioned, Guillaume. No, you mentioned, Gilles, the 400 pages for the Belgian CRM in terms of rules. It's true that if you have a marketplace that needs to participate to several CRMs, it's a lot of page to read. And so indeed, if there could be some harmonization on some elements, that would certainly help. It will help from an operational perspective. It would help also from a cost perspective, because this has a cost. And so in terms of bringing the cost down, it would be interesting also. It would help further down the road to go for more regional, but that's, and I think that was mentioned earlier, a more longer term goal.
Thank you. Maybe let's go in reverse order now. So you start again. So let's leave aside the demand response and storage. You, as Eurelectric, you represent the biggest share of benefiters in terms of capacity providers to capacity mechanism. What is Eurelectric point of view on how to design capacity mechanism that provide efficient and effective long-term signals for investments, while at the same time avoiding too distort wholesale markets, be them short term or forward, which I guess is one of also the objectives of Euroelectric.
Yeah. And I think it has an important point is the fact that short-term markets should be well implemented, should be efficient. You should have an efficient use of the resources, being capacity, being interconnections. Why? Because all those long-term contracts, being CRM, being CFDs or PPAs, have to rely on the functioning of those short-term markets. We've seen during the energy crisis that indeed the short-term markets, they help, let's say, tackle the situation. They help go through the energy crisis, even if the prices were extremely high, but that's a separate discussion. I think in terms of security of supply, we had no issues. So that's one thing. Make sure that those longer-term contracts or those capacity markets are not affecting the short-term energy markets. One thing. There are a lot of design features. We've seen in the regulation the high-level requirements, and indeed, the different member states have gone for different implementation. So we end up with a patchwork of elements, and to this extent, I think that the proposal that the DG is putting on the table is one way to give the carrot to member states to try to align. I know it should have been a difficult exercise on your side, because indeed, you're mentioning that if a member state cross all checkboxes, they would get the approval without any long investigation. So I think it's really important to have this, and indeed to see what you believe based on your let's say previous cases, what could fly. Of course, as Euroelectric, we had several comments on those elements. I don't know if we want to go through that now, or you want to discuss it further. So let's focus maybe on two elements. The first one is related to the use of the European Resource Adequacy Assessment. As Euroelectric, we still believe that the National Resource Adequacy Assessment could bring a complementary view to this European Resource Adequacy Assessment. It could give a finer granularity. It could give a bit more of an informed let's say, elements for the decision. So as a complement, as I said, that's one element. The second element is related to cost allocation. Indeed, you're focusing on the cost allocation that is related to the prices. I think between 1% and 5% of the hours where the prices are the highest. The issue is that in our view, the prices are reflecting not only the supply-demand balance, but also the evolution of commodity prices. So you might get very high prices at the end of the year, while you might have very low price at the start of the year, just because commodity prices have evolved during the year. That was the case, for instance, in 2021. And so, indeed, that's the reason why we believe that it would be interesting to consider whether a metric based on volume, so for instance, the residual demand could could correct this bias. So that's something probably to be discussed, because it might be more difficult to obtain, for instance, in the red than prices.
Thank you. Gilles, Belgium has been one of the most active countries with capacity mechanisms in the past years. I think you've had lots of discussion with colleagues from DG Comp. Can you tell us what are the lessons learned in all the phases, from the design, the negotiation, approval, and the implementation? Are there things that work particularly well, and others which, going back, maybe you would change, or you would ask legislators to change? Thank you.
I'll try to be concise, because it's quite a broad question, but I think there are three elements. Let's say the regulatory, the design, and the implementation. I think in terms of regulatory, so we had quite, when I now say we, I mean the Belgian government had quite some exchanges with the European Commission. Not only for the first approval, there was a deep dive investigation, but also for the reapprovals, because we evolved, and that was often at proposal of ELIA, certain design elements of the Belgian capacity mechanism, which then made that the new state aid case had to be notified. And so one of the open questions for me is under this new framework, because technically speaking, I think the 3 variants of the Belgian CRM still fit with the criteria list. How will this evolve? Do we expect that you get more flexibility, more freedom between brackets to have a national process to evolve the capacity mechanism design? Is indeed still a re-notification of when there is a significant amendment required. So I think that's one element. To be very clear, I don't question the need to have state aid approval. I think it's very fair if you give away millions of euros of subsidies that somebody judges whether your mechanism is well designed. The second one is indeed the design, and I touched upon it in my previous comment. We have a tendency as I would say as people, especially here in the forum, to ensure that our capacity mechanisms cover all the potential cases. So we want to cover all the edge cases because there could be market abuse. And again, that's a very fair concern. But as a result, we often have the drive to go until the end, until the last comma and point is perfect, which means that we have a very complex design. And that's a trade-off that we want to make. Again, barriers for demand-side participation. You could very easily check measurements of demand-side management at high prices compared to, for example, today in Belgium, you have a complex baseline methodology where we try to estimate what would have been the consumption without the price reaction. And so you can really simplify that, but then you need to accept that maybe you're not covering all the potential edge cases. And then in terms of implementation, which is I think the most overlooked part, and that's probably, I think we will have similar discussions as there were initially for, I would say, the harmonization of the electricity markets or for the balancing markets, to say it's a good idea to launch Mari Picasso, but then it takes 10 years to implement these kinds of projects, because the implementation challenges are often, from my perspective, a bit overlooked. I can understand as people setting policy that's not really relevant for you. It's a problem which will be solved, but in the end, we should not underestimate. And that's why I was in the previous panel also challenging a little bit the discussion on harmonization. For me, it's fine to discuss harmonization, but we should first discuss which problem are we trying to solve, and are there not alternative solutions? You could go towards a regional harmonization in terms of, and then have a very lengthy implementation project, or you could accept that you have national CRMs which are implicitly coupled, and where you assume that indeed the dimensioning is following the correct way of working, but that you avoid the spillover effects because you cut them at the border. And that could be less efficient than, let's say, a 15-year target model where you have regional coupling, but maybe that's sufficient.
Thank you, Gilles. Zeni, we've heard already some examples of concrete experiences. From your point of view, do you see any best practice in terms of capacity mechanism design for flexible demand participation that you'd recommend, or maybe on the contrary, what type of design types shouldn't be followed based on your experience?
Yeah, when it comes to different observation that we made throughout our membership, basically, there are some good examples, it seems. When we offer the example of capacity mechanism UK, we have some eyebrow from the Commission, not specifically MAT, but DGN, and saying, please don't bring us outside the European Union. We want good examples here. But that said, UK is a good example because it's quite streamlined, contrary to what we have seen in other countries. So I would say, for the bidding threshold, which is quite low, it actually allocates to all the participants, from residential to customers to large industries, to bid into the market. Then another one that we actually quite sympathetic to, I think it was mentioned maybe in the panel one, was Ireland. That is because it also puts penalties when you over kind of promise but under deliver in the capacity terms from the marketplace. So it makes also a little bit of trust and reliability between what is needed in the system in order to also not pressure the grid, and what the market participant can actually deliver at the time when it's needed, the capacity. And it generates the right remuneration at the time. Because what we notice right now, and maybe coming to the implementation angle, it's like technology neutrality remuneration is in place, or at least what they are regulation is trying to do. But we tend to say performance-based remuneration should be the first one, because it's not only if you are available at the time when capacity is needed in order to be remunerated, but you have to be reliable and to perform well. So these two. In France, what is particular, I would say, it's in terms of adequacy and capacity, they are doing well. The fact that they actually put you under watch and saying that within the margin of 5 or minus 5% of kind of merging, you will be assessed by RT whether your capacity was enough, availability, and so on. So they have put in system kind of a trace you whether you are delivering as it is required. So there are some good examples. In Italy, not necessarily capacity mechanism, but what we have observed is good because they just gave indication of locational grid constraints. So actually the market participants, they know where the flexibility is needed, where they should be available. The point is, and coming to one comment that it was made, that markets are working well, not necessarily, because we don't see many markets to be open so we can bid for. And that is another side of the coin that we are working on, and coming back also the fact that not all the regulatory provisions have been implemented. But that I can offer as an example that we have observed.
You didn't mention Belgium. Is that on the good or the bad side?
Well, to please my neighbor, I would say good, but we haven't spotted it particularly as a good example. It's like in the mapping we do on the annual basis of market monitor, basically is put as emerging in the right direction, like markets merging and kind of examples in the right direction, but it's not put in the list as a best practice yet.
Thank you. Guillaume, you're next. From a competition perspective, which of the features that are listed in the, well, first in your slides, but even more in detailed form in the CSAF annex, you think there's more room for improvement, looking at what capacity mechanisms are in place today? So are you focusing specifically on certain aspects in your state aid approvals? You see maybe some principle better already implemented than others? Why we need also more harmonization in certain other aspects?
Many thanks. Well, the truth is there is no specific elements. It's really a list of various elements and design features that matter. And this is because the framework over the past decades has allowed leaves freedom to member states to come up with their own design features to reach policy objectives that are enshrined in the electric regulation, in stated rules. And actually, this has probably been a very useful period to foster innovation in terms of designs, and also to allow member states to learn from their experience and improve the design of their capacity mechanism. That being said, as we've been saying since this morning, it's also come with an unfortunate trade-off, which is additional complexity across the European Union to implement cross-border participation. That's one aspect. But also for stakeholders that are present in more than one member state and need to learn and read the 400 pages rules in all member states, that brings overall complexity in the internal market. So which is why now we have a list of design features and stumbling blocks that are very differentiated from one country to another. And indeed, this CSAF framework was also the opportunity to look at what are the common best practices to which we could gear towards. And maybe if I had to isolate one specific aspect, not because it's more important than others, but also because it was listed very high in the Slido, and because it was mentioned earlier in the panel, the cost recovery aspect by electricity consumer is probably one of the crucial aspects to allow a level playing field between implicit and explicit demand response in capacity mechanisms. And here, what we have seen also based on the ACER monitoring reports on security of supply is that the case practice was quite different from one country to another. And in particular, what we've seen is that some member states have been spreading this cost on almost half of the consumption hour of the year, which might not be the best way to incentivize demand response addressing scarcity issues, because in the end, capacity mechanisms are here to solution security of supply during a given number of hours, which is reflected by this reliability standard. In most cases, it's between 1 and 5 hours of adequacy issues on average per year. So probably spreading the cost of capacity mechanism on a smaller number of hours. What we suggested indeed in the draft that we published in the public consultation was to 1 to 5% of the hours is probably a best way, in our view, to foster the development of demand response and also send a price signal which is consistent with the objective of the capacity mechanism, compared to a situation where this cost would be spread on a higher number of hours. Then, how those hours should be chosen? Maybe a quick word on that to answer to the first intervention. Well, I think it really relates to what was said earlier. We can agree on the overall objective to go one step more towards harmonization, but when we look at the specificities, it requires to make choices, and well, we could have endless debate on what is the best indicator to assess the stress periods, and at least from our understanding, there is no perfect signal. Now, some member states have opted for price signals. I think this is the case for the Belgian capacity mechanism. Others have opted for net demand. So you deduce the intermittent rest production from the load, and that gives you an indication of what might be the quantity to be to be done by dispatchable capacity. But that's also imperfect because it also depends on the security of supply risk depends on the number of capacity which are under maintenance when to address the net demand supply. Some member states have been reflected upon margins to isolate the best period. So what I'm saying here is that there are we could have a long debate on what are the best hours on which the cost should be spread on consumers. In the end, if we want to do one step towards harmonization, you probably have to make a choice, which will be imperfect, but that has value in itself because it brings simplification. Voilà. Then maybe a very quick word on what was said by Ilya on how sometimes stated decisions can bring complexity when a member state wishes to adjust some aspect of the capacity mechanism. I think this goes almost beyond the topic of capacity mechanism. It's almost a legal issue. Once you have a stated decision, what can you do within the scope of this stated decision? And on this, for us, I'd say when it comes to at least the CSAF target models is to respect those requirements. And then it's probably indeed useful to leave some margin of maneuver within as long as those requirements are respected, so that member state can adjust over the lifetime of the capacity mechanism some aspects. So on this, we would rather agree with the Ilya colleagues.
Thank you, Guillaume. Back to you, Emma. Last year, together with Leonardo Mills, the director of FSR, you published a paper called Cross-Border Participation, a False Hope for Fixing Capacity Markets Externalities, ? I think few people in the room have read it and found it relevant for the debate. Could you tell us a bit more of your main findings and any recommendation coming out of it that you could link with today's debate?
Yes, thank you for the invitation. And indeed, we've worked a bit on the explicit cross-border participation requirements. So our first step was to step back and say, okay, what's the objective in the first place of this explicit cross-border participation rule? So what is the issue we're trying to solve? And one answer is to just avoid over-procurement, so avoiding that every member state tries to achieve autarky at national level. And it's, of course, very important, but there are easier ways to avoid over-procurement, including implicit cross-border participation, which consists in deducting imports from the capacity demand. So that's one example of an objective. And in this case, explicit doesn't necessarily perform better than implicit. A second objective could be to kind of co-optimize and coordinate capacity procurement between two or more capacity market countries. So in this case, explicit cross-border participation can be interesting, of course, because there might be regions where capacity is cheaper. But in this case, also it becomes quite complex because every member state might have separate bidding zones for capacity. So we end up having a lot of different capacity prices and auctions. And also in this case, the pricing might not be very efficient if the capacity markets are not harmonized in the first place. As it was mentioned before, if the contracts and the penalties are not harmonized, it's difficult to have good pricing, including in explicit cross-border participation. So in this case, I would argue harmonization would be needed. But if we have harmonization, then we could think of simpler or more efficient solutions like coupling, so capacity market coupling. It's not such a far-fetched idea. If we look, Italy has a couple capacity markets within its internal bidding zones. So we already have an example to look into. So I mentioned two objectives. There is a third one, which for us was the most important, because today we have capacity markets, but we also have energy-only zones. And a big issue is that with high levels of interconnectivity, capacity markets have negative externalities on the energy-only zones. Why negative? Well, because in the long term, subsidizing capacity only on one side of the border will divert investments from the energy-only zones. So in the long term, a capacity market might endanger security of supply, actually, in the neighboring zones. So it's the energy-only zones, sometimes we say they're free riding, but it's actually only a short-term effect. So explicit cross-border participation in this case could be used to try to restore the investment incentives in the energy-only zones, because now we allow for these foreign generators to get a compensation. So maybe they won't be diverted so much. But what we found is that in this case, explicit cross-border participation cannot work really well because of the asymmetry in market design. So what happens is that only a few generators in the energy-only zones are allowed to enter. And it means that only the already existing generators that are able to bid at zero, that don't need a capacity payment in the first place, will be selected and the price will be close to zero. So yeah, so we've seen that for these three different objectives, explicit cross-border participation might not be the best rule. So we recommended to tolerate implicits in the short term, but also we acknowledge that it's really not perfect. So in the long term, we really need to think of going towards harmonization, maybe integration of these capacity markets, even though it's a very long-term perspective. And I wanted to comment also on one last thing, so on flexibility support schemes. So we're also looking into that in our research. And I see there are two very important priorities. One is to coordinate capacity procurement across borders. And the other is to coordinate capacity and flexibility procurements. We've heard about these two issues previously, but they're actually conflicting because to go towards regionalization and Europeanization, we need harmonization. And we've actually achieved already quite some harmonization. But if we want to also integrate capacity and flexibility procurement, what we will probably see is a lot of tailor-made solutions, because no one knows what's the best form of support for flexibility yet. So if we pursue that priority, maybe harmonization and integration would be more difficult. So, yeah.
Thank you. Maybe just a follow-up question, because you mentioned implicit participation. That's something also we looked at in our report. What about explicit direct interconnector participation? Is that something you looked into your report as a possible alternative, or not in your study?
So we didn't look into it in much details, but I would say that in a lot of cases, the interconnector is not necessarily the limiting element during the scarcity period, and it's why the maximum entry capacity is lower than the interconnection capacity. So intuitively, there shouldn't be congestion if in the capacity markets if they were coupled, but it depends on the cases. And if it happens that interconnection is the critical element or the congested element, then yes, remunerating it would make sense. But for now, it seems not to be the general case.
Thank you very much. I would use the next 10 minutes before we conclude for questions from the audience. Maybe let's take one first from the room, and then we go to the people online.
Thank you. Now we heard about explicit and implicit participation cross-border. What about implicit participation of DSR in CRMs? I think this is also an important issue, which is also missing in Belgium, I think, no? Because you don't, okay, maybe we can discuss later, but so there's no baselining, there's no misincentives like in deck gaming or things like this. There's no derating, and there is also a remuneration for DSR. If you have an implicit participation, that means dynamic refinancing of the costs of the CRMs in the 1% to 5% highest price hours, which I think is a very good feature of CRMs because that brings the load down in this highest price hours, and that saves a lot of money. So I think implicit DSR participation is also a very important topic. What do you think? Maybe Zeni from Smart N.
Zeni, you want to react?
Do you want to react maybe first? Okay. Yeah. No. Yes, indeed. We think implicit should be incentivized, definitely. But we are more on the explicit side, in the sense that implicit you have preconditions which are depending mainly also in the regulated sphere, also from the network tariffs, and then you have to actually combine or kind of react to the price signals. What we say at Smart N, it's a bit further in the sense explicit to allocate. Well, why? Because you have two preconditions. One is to give, let's say, access to independent aggregators and to do the role for the customers, basically to empower them to make the best choice in the possible market playground, let's say. But in that sense, you need to open all the markets. So in order to see which is more beneficial at that point in time when you have to bid. And that is not existing at this moment. Like you don't have many markets are not available. So you don't have choice, basically. I understand what you're saying, but in order to make it happen, you need to have all these setups in place. And secondly, because the customer himself will not know. So you have to actually not educate, but to facilitate on the preconditions of kind of engagement with the markets. So implicit, yes, definitely, but we always push for explicit instead, just to empower fully the market bidding. So I don't know if you...
Yeah, maybe a small clarification. So in terms of consideration of demand-side management in the Belgian CRM, you have two steps. You have the calibration, the volume determination that you need in the auction, and then you have the auction itself. For the volume determination, there again, we split in different categories of demand-side management. You have demand-side management from existing usages, read parties that are typically active on the day-ahead market, but also implicit flex from EV charging, also from future evolutions of DSM, like electrification of industry. We assume that they are 75% flexible, but we don't. So we use that flexibility, that future estimated flexibility, to actually reduce the demand curve in the CRM. And then there is a second step, which if we don't observe the expected existing DSR to actually contribute in the CRM and bid into the market, then there is an additional correction on the demand curve. So in the end, I would say we rely quite heavily on implicit demand side management. But of course, and this is always the other side of the medal, if you can contract something, you can ensure penalties, you can do a validation check. With implicit, there is always the question mark. It's not because you have observed it one time that you will observe it in the future. And that's, for me, the trade-off very important in the discussion. Yes, you should encourage implicit, especially if for certain parties the barriers are too high to participate. But you should then try to well calibrate how much contribution you can actually expect to still reach that reliability criterion. And the last point there is then indeed what's in it for them. Is it just the fact that they don't consume at high prices, or are there other incentives? And do you then have conflicting incentives?
Thank you. Sorry, I'll take a question from the audience. There are some of these from the audience online. Some of these have been sitting there since the first panel. Maybe the first one, which can also be a reply to what was said earlier by Emma, directly to you, Guillaume. What is the added value of cross-border participation? Wouldn't a coordinated dimensioning provide the same effects with much less bureaucracy?
That's a very interesting question. I'd say that maybe to start with the first point, what is the value in cross-border participation? It is indeed to first avoid over-procurement, and by that, making sure that the contribution of imports to addressing security of supply issues are fully taken into account. So that's one of the important aspects. And the second aspect is to make sure that the value that everyone brings to the system is directed to the stakeholder that bring this value. And I think this also echo to a bit what Emma said earlier, which is in some cases the value might come probably mostly from the interconnection, because you have plenty of capacity that on the other side of the border that could contribute to security of supply, because they are not in a stress situation when the member state where the CM applies is in a stress situation. And in this case, the value should be blocked to the interconnection. In other cases, the limiting factor would be the capacity on the other side of the border, and we believe that it's fair in terms of competition that in those cases, the value is blocked to those stakeholders. So that would be the first simple answers to what is the value of cross-border participation. Then, could it be improved by a regionalized approach? I'd rephrase the question like that. Probably yes. Probably surely it would be much simpler for market players. And it's probably a laudable objective. That being said, I think we should not forget what was necessary to do a similar transition in the energy markets or balancing markets, ancillary services. It took years and years on agreeing on very specific details. Simplicity and complexity can mean many different things, but in the end, if you want to have a proper regional procurement, it means that all the member states in the considered region need to agree on aspects which are very specific. And that means that we are probably not 1 year from that. It will take time, and it's normal. I think for electricity market, it took something like 10 years before market coupling was properly achieved. But this would indeed require to dive a bit in the detail and agree at the regional level where dimensioning is done to agree on how availability should be checked, during which type of hours, what should be the eligibility rules, the pre-qualification rules, as I said earlier, the penalties. So voilà, many important aspects that are touched upon in the ENTSO-E report, on which indeed we should go into further details.
Thank you very much. Very last question, maybe if someone wants to take it quickly, the following one. How do panelists think that tighter emission restrictions could be applied to CRMs?
Can I maybe share a practical example here? One of the elements we brought towards the Belgian government brought towards the European Commission was the reduction of CO2 emission limits to a level where turbojets, which are ancient plane engines, were excluded from participating in the CRM. And then there was discussion: should you further reduce the emission targets? A study was done, which actually showed that you have kind of communicating vessels effect very strongly. If you reduce emission targets in Belgium, then we're just going to be more import dependent from Germany, which had quite a high CO2 intensity. And so the conclusion of that work and that study, and it's still a bit somewhere in limbo, is that in the end, the initiative to further reduce emission targets should be on European level, because we are a very tightly coupled market. So it's difficult you're shooting in your own foot as a country in terms of cost for your capacity mechanism. Only that point, because indeed it's good to lower the targets in general. If you do it on, let's go towards a European kind of trajectory for reducing emission limits, which might be controversial, of course.
It's also the question of what is the right vehicle. I think capacity markets are there for earning adequacy issues. There are other tools that are there for triggering decarbonization. And we know that the end goal is net zero by 2050. And so indeed, investment should take place with this in mind. And an investor will do that naturally, because there are other incentives not in the capacity markets per se. I know also that in the stated guidelines, I think there are also requirements to be compliant with those decarbonization targets, if I'm correct.
Yes, indeed. The truth is, for sure, these emission restrictions are really important in the stated assessments because they are the minimum thing that member states should do. But again, in the case practice, we've experimented many other things. One also that is also in the stated guidelines is indeed the fact that any capacity supported in the capacity mechanism should be compliant with climate goals, which means that we should not lock in fossil fuel capacities over a period that would not be compliant with climate goals. That's also an assessment that in many countries, in some cases, are dedicated typically to the NRA, that typically would have the power to reduce a contract length to a new fossil fuel capacity to make sure that it's not locked in. But in general, I think we can show openness when it comes to being more restrictive for environmental concerns. Typically, I mentioned earlier, limitation of long-term contracts to only non-fossil technologies is something that we've already approved in the past. We will probably see with the coordination between non-fossil flex and capacity mechanism places where member state decides to have a minimum quantity of capacity which is non-fossil. That's also possible. What would not be possible for us is like the other share of capacity is fossil fuel only, that we would not agree. But if a minimum share is reserved to non-fossil flexibility technologies in general, that in the context of a CM, that's something possible. And indeed, then it can be about reducing the CO2 emission threshold. And probably some ideas to which we didn't think about yet. But I'd say that any member state willing to go towards better environmental standards, we would, in principle, support.
Thank you all, and sorry for all of those who wanted to ask a question. We are running out of time. We already eat up 12 minutes or 13 minutes of your conclusion, Javier.
Okay.
But that was intentionally a bit of a buffer. So yeah, over to you if you can say some words.
I mean, session needs to be closed, and that's my role now. I'm not trying to conclude because, as you all have seen, this is a very wide topic with a lot of aspects that have triggered a lot of discussions, and that's why we only have 2 minutes left. I would say only thank you, everyone. Thank you, the panelists, for your time, for your effort, for your generosity, also the quality of the interventions you have made. Thank you also the audience, both here physically and online. Your questions also have helped having an intense and interesting and enriching debate on capacity mechanisms. And last but of course not least, thanks a lot moderators Anna, Marco for driving the panels, and Christian for your great work on making this possible, finding the panelists and organizing everything. practical information, also very interesting for the online people. For next time, there is lunch now at 1, so people here physically will enjoy the nice food of ENTSO-E. No, it's not prepared by Christian or Marco, but it is very nice, and we will have still more time to discuss the pending questions. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.